Polar bear kills mother and child in remote village. March 28, 2025. The wind had been howling across the Beaufort Sea for 3 days straight, carrying with it the scent of desperation that only comes when ice breaks apart too early in the season. Anna Peterson stood at her kitchen window in Kaktovik, Alaska, watching the morning light filter through the perpetual haze that seemed to blanket their small village of 250 souls. Her breath fogged the glass as she pressed her face closer, searching the horizon for any sign that the weather might break. Behind her, 6-year-old Liam Peterson sat at their small wooden table, methodically eating his oatmeal while humming a tune he'd learned at the village school. "Mama, why does the wind sound angry?" Liam asked, his spoon clinking against the ceramic bowl their neighbor Mrs. Kanguk had made for them the previous Christmas. Anna turned from the window, her long auburn hair catching the pale morning light. She had moved to Kaktovik 5 years ago, following her then-husband Marcus to this remote outpost on Barter Island, where he worked as a wildlife researcher. The marriage hadn't survived the isolation, but Anna had found something here that she couldn't name, something that kept her anchored to this harsh landscape, even after Marcus returned to Anchorage with divorce papers and promises to visit Liam that he rarely kept. "The wind isn't angry, sweetheart," Anna replied, settling into the chair across from her son. "It's just trying to move the ice around. Sometimes when things are too heavy or stuck in place, you have to push really hard to move them." She reached across and brushed a strand of Liam's sandy brown hair from his forehead. He had his father's eyes, pale blue like Arctic ice, but Anna's stubborn chin and quick smile. The truth was more complicated than she could explain to a 6-year-old. The ice was breaking up earlier each year, forcing polar bears to spend longer periods on land, searching for food in places where humans had built their lives. Anna had lived here long enough to understand the delicate balance that existed between the Inupiat people who called this place home and the massive predators who ruled the ice. She had also lived here long enough to know when that balance was shifting. Thomas Kanguk, their 62-year-old neighbor, and one of the village's most experienced hunters, had stopped by 3 days earlier with a concerned expression that Anna had learned to read like weather signs. Thomas had been born in Kaktovik, raised on stories of polar bears and the respect they demanded, and he possessed an intuitive understanding of their behavior that came from generations of coexistence. "Ice is wrong this year," Thomas had said, standing in Anna's doorway with his weathered hands clasped behind his back. "Bears are staying on land too long." Getting desperate. He had looked past Anna toward Liam, who was building elaborate structures with blocks on the living room floor. "Keep the boy close," Thomas had added. "Don't let him play outside alone, not even for a few minutes." Anna had nodded, understanding the weight of his words. She had lived through several spring seasons when bears wandered into the village, but something felt different this year. The animals that passed through seemed more agitated, more willing to investigate human dwellings and garbage areas that they would normally avoid. Just last week, Rebecca Olamaun, who lived on the other side of the village, had found massive paw prints circling her house for 3 consecutive nights. Now, as Anna watched Liam finish his breakfast, she felt a familiar knot of anxiety in her stomach. She worked as the village's part-time administrative coordinator, a job that required her to maintain communication with various government agencies and coordinate supply deliveries. Today, she needed to submit reports to the North Slope Borough Office, a task that would require several hours of focused work on her computer. Normally, she would send Liam to play with the Nashukpuk children next door, but Thomas's warning echoed in her mind. "What are we doing today, Mama?" Liam asked, scraping the last of his oatmeal from the bowl. He had developed the habit of making his food last as long as possible during meals, as if extending breakfast might somehow extend the day itself. "I have some work to do this morning," Anna replied, already mentally reorganizing her schedule. How about you help me with the reports? You can practice your letters while I type. She had been teaching Liam to write his name and simple words, supplementing the education he received at the small village school that served children from kindergarten through 8th grade. Liam's face brightened at the prospect of what he considered grown-up work. "Can I use the special pencils?" he asked, referring to a set of colored pencils that Anna reserved for important occasions. "Of course," Anna said, clearing away the breakfast dishes. Their house was small but well-maintained, consisting of 3 rooms and a bathroom that Marcus had helped winterize before their separation. The main room served as kitchen, dining area, and living space, with Anna's work area occupying a corner near the largest window. Liam's bedroom was barely large enough for a twin bed and small dresser, while Anna's room contained a double bed and the house's only closet. As Anna settled at her computer, Liam spread his paper and pencils across the kitchen table, creating an elaborate workspace that made him feel important and included. The morning passed quietly, with only the constant wind and the occasional sound of a snowmobile in the distance breaking the silence. Anna worked steadily through her reports, documenting supply needs and population changes, while Liam practiced writing letters and drawing pictures of polar bears that looked more like friendly dogs than the massive predators that actually roamed their landscape. Around 11:30, Anna heard the distinctive sound of Thomas Kanguk's four-wheeler approaching their house. She looked up from her computer to see him parking near their front steps, his movements carrying the urgency that she had learned to associate with important news in a small community where information traveled quickly and accuracy was essential for survival. "Anna!" Thomas called, knocking on their door with the firm, measured rhythm that meant business rather than a social visit. Anna opened the door to find him standing with his hands thrust deep in his parka pockets, his weathered face showing the strain of whatever news he carried. "What is it?" Anna asked, stepping aside to let him enter. Thomas stomped the snow from his boots and pulled off his wool hat, revealing grey hair that stuck up in all directions. "Bear," Thomas said simply. "Big male, maybe 900 pounds. Been tracking him since dawn. He's moving through the village, checking houses, getting bolder." Thomas glanced toward Liam, who had stopped his writing to listen to the adult conversation. "This one is different, Anna. Hungrier, more aggressive. He broke into the Aknavagak storage shed an hour ago, tore it apart, looking for food." Anna felt her stomach drop. The Aknavagak family lived only 6 houses away, close enough that a bear could cover the distance in minutes if something motivated it to move. "Where is he now?" she asked. "Lost the trail near the school," Thomas replied. "Ground is too hard to track clearly, but I think he's moving toward the beach. Could be anywhere by now." He looked directly at Anna with a serious expression that meant he was about to give advice that could mean the difference between life and death. "Don't go outside today. Keep Liam inside. Lock your doors and make sure your windows are secure." Anna nodded, her mind already running through their emergency preparations. Like every household in Kaktovik, they kept bear spray near the door and had practiced the safety protocols that were as much a part of Arctic life as knowing how to dress for cold weather. But the knowledge that a particularly aggressive bear was actively hunting in their immediate vicinity changed everything. "How long do you think?" Anna began, but Thomas was already shaking his head. "Could be hours, could be days," he said. "These bears, when they get desperate like this, they don't follow normal patterns. They'll try anything." He moved toward the door, then paused. "I'm going to call Frank Nasukpuk and Samuel Olamon, get a few of us organized to track this bear properly. Maybe we can encourage it to move toward the dump site, away from the houses." After Thomas left, Anna locked the door and checked the windows, making sure the latches were secure. Their house sat slightly elevated on posts, a design feature that provided some protection against flooding, but also meant that the front steps created a small platform that a determined bear could easily navigate. Anna had seen video footage of polar bears opening doors and climbing through windows, demonstrations of intelligence and adaptability that made them far more dangerous than most people realized. "Mama, why did Mr. Thomas look worried?" Liam asked, having returned to his writing but clearly focused on the adult conversation he had overheard. Anna considered how much to explain. Liam had been raised in Kaktovik and understood polar bears as a fact of life rather than exotic animals, but she didn't want to frighten him unnecessarily. At the same time, his safety might depend on his understanding of the situation. "There's a polar bear near the village," Anna said, settling back at her computer while keeping one eye on the window. "Mr. Thomas wants to make sure everyone stays safe, while he and the other hunters figure out where the bear is going." "Is it a big bear?" Liam asked, his eyes widening with the mixture of fascination and concern that children show when discussing things that are both exciting and potentially dangerous. "Yes, it's a very big bear," Anna replied. "That's why we need to stay inside today and let the grown-ups handle it." She turned back to her computer but found it difficult to concentrate on administrative reports when her attention was drawn to every sound outside their house. The wind continued to howl across Barter Island, carrying with it the scent of open water and rotting kelp from the beach. Anna knew that polar bears possessed an extraordinary sense of smell, capable of detecting seals breathing through holes in ice from miles away. She wondered what scents this particular bear was following as it moved through Kaktovik, and whether the normal human odors of cooking food, heating fuel and garbage might be registering as potential food sources to an animal that had spent too many weeks without a successful hunt. By noon, the reports were finished, but Anna found herself reluctant to move away from her computer and the sense of normalcy that work provided. Liam had covered 3 sheets of paper with his careful letter practice, interspersed with drawings of bears, seals, and what appeared to be their house surrounded by protective barriers made of ice blocks. "I'm hungry," Liam announced, pushing back from the table and stretching his arms above his head. "Can we make grilled cheese?" Anna smiled, grateful for the simple request that pulled her back from her anxious monitoring of the world outside their windows. "That sounds perfect," she said, moving toward the kitchen area. "You want to help me cut the cheese?" As they prepared lunch together, Anna found herself listening for sounds that might indicate the bear's presence nearby. She had learned to distinguish between the normal noise of wind against their house and the different creaking sounds that might suggest something large moving around their property. So far, everything seemed normal, but she remained alert to changes. They had just sat down to eat when Anna heard the distinctive sound of multiple four-wheelers approaching their area of the village. Through the window, she could see Thomas Kanguk leading a group of 4 men, all armed and moving, with the purposeful coordination of experienced hunters. Anna recognized Frank Nashukpuk, Samuel Olomaun, and David Aknavigak among the group, men who had spent their lives reading the behavior of Arctic wildlife and understanding the delicate balance between coexistence and survival. The hunters stopped near Anna's house, and Thomas approached the door while the others spread out to establish sightlines in multiple directions. Anna opened the door before he could knock, noting the increased tension in his posture. "Found fresh tracks near the community center," Thomas reported. "This bear is big, Anna. Bigger than I thought. Paws the size of dinner plates, stride length that puts him close to 10 feet tall when he rears up." Thomas glanced back toward his hunting companions, then returned his attention to Anna. "We're going to try to track him toward the beach, get him away from the houses. But I need you to understand something." Anna felt her pulse quicken. "What?" "This bear isn't behaving like a normal bear. He's not avoiding human scent, he's following it. Frank found evidence that he spent time investigating the garbage area behind the store, but he also found tracks leading directly to several houses, including yours. Thomas pointed toward the ground near Anna's front steps. "See those depressions in the snow near your walkway? That bear was here sometime in the last few hours, probably while we were talking this morning." Anna looked where Thomas was pointing and felt her blood turn cold. The wind had filled in most of the details, but she could clearly see large, disturbed areas in the snow that suggested something massive had been moving around their property. The realization that a 900-pound polar bear had been investigating their house while she and Liam ate breakfast and worked on reports filled her with a terror so complete that she had to grip the doorframe to remain steady. "What do we do?" Anna asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You stay inside, keep the doors locked, and don't open them for anyone unless you know for certain who it is," Thomas replied. "We're going to track this bear and try to resolve the situation, but it could take hours, maybe longer." He looked past Anna toward Liam, who had abandoned his sandwich to listen to the adult conversation. "Keep the boy away from the windows. If this bear decides to investigate your house more thoroughly, we don't want him to see movement inside." After the hunters left, Anna locked the door and moved away from the windows, her mind racing through contingency plans that all seemed inadequate against an animal that could weigh as much as 4 adult men and possess the intelligence to solve problems that stood between it and potential food sources. She had read accounts of polar bears learning to open doors, breaking through walls, and demonstrating persistence that could last for hours when they detected something that interested them. "Mama, why do you look scared?" Liam asked, abandoning his lunch to study Anna's face with the perceptive attention that children apply to reading adult emotions. Anna forced herself to take a deep breath and project calm that she didn't feel. "I'm not scared," she said, sitting down beside Liam and pulling him onto her lap. "I'm just being careful, because that's what we do when wild animals are nearby." She held him close, inhaling the scent of his hair and feeling the warmth of his small body against hers. They spent the afternoon playing quiet games and reading books, activities that kept them occupied while allowing Anna to remain alert to sounds outside. Around 3 o'clock, Anna heard gunshots in the distance, 3 evenly spaced reports that echoed across the village and suggested that the hunters had located their target. She felt a wave of relief, assuming that the crisis had been resolved, but the feeling was short-lived when she realized that the shots had been followed by sustained shouting rather than the satisfied voices of successful hunters. 20 minutes later, Thomas returned to Anna's house, but his expression was grimmer than before. "We found him," Thomas said, accepting Anna's invitation to enter, "but we didn't get him. He charged Frank when we tried to approach, knocked him down, then disappeared toward the beach. Frank's okay, just shaken up, but this bear is more aggressive than anything I've seen in 40 years of hunting." Anna felt her brief moment of relief evaporate completely. "What does that mean for us?" "It means he's still out there, still looking for food, and now he's been shot at," Thomas replied. "That could make him more cautious, or it could make him more desperate. Bears that have been wounded or threatened sometimes become more likely to approach human dwellings because they're looking for easy food sources." "Was he wounded?" Anna asked. Thomas shook his head. "Frank missed. Bear was moving too fast, and Frank was more focused on not getting mauled than on accuracy." Thomas moved toward the window and peered out at the late afternoon landscape. "We're going to keep tracking him, but I want you to know that if this bear decides to investigate your house tonight, you need to be ready." "Ready how?" Anna asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Bear spray by the door, kitchen knives within reach, and a plan for getting you and Liam into the bathroom if the bear manages to get inside," Thomas said. "The bathroom is the most secure room in your house, only one small window, and the door locks from the inside. He turned from the window to look directly at Anna. "I hope it won't come to that, but this bear has already demonstrated behavior that's outside normal patterns." After Thomas left for the second time, Anna found herself unable to focus on anything except the sounds outside their house. Every gust of wind, every creak of settling wood, every distant noise from other parts of the village made her heart rate spike as she tried to determine whether the sounds were normal or might indicate the approach of a massive predator that had already demonstrated its willingness to investigate human dwellings. Liam sensed the change in his mother's mood and became more clingy as the afternoon progressed, abandoning his usual independent play to remain close to Anna's side. They prepared dinner together, macaroni and cheese that neither of them finished, and then settled on the couch to read picture books that Anna hoped might provide distraction from the anxiety that filled their small house like a physical presence. As evening approached, Anna closed all the curtains and turned on every light in the house, creating what she hoped would be clear signals of human occupation that might discourage a curious bear. She had read that polar bears sometimes avoided well-lit areas, preferring to investigate potential food sources under cover of darkness when they felt less exposed to human interference. Around 8 o'clock, Anna heard Thomas's four-wheeler returning, but this time the engine sound was accompanied by at least 2 other vehicles. Through a gap in the curtains, she could see that the hunting party had grown to include several additional men, some carrying rifles and others equipped with spotlights and other tracking equipment. Thomas knocked on the door with his familiar rhythm, and Anna let him in, along with Frank Nashhookpuk, whose face showed the strain of his earlier encounter with the bear. Frank was a man in his late 50s who had hunted polar bears legally for decades and understood their behavior as well as anyone in the village, making his obvious concern even more troubling. "We lost him again," Frank said without preamble. "This bear is smart, Anna." "Smarter than normal. He's avoiding our tracking attempts, doubling back on his own trail, using the wind to mask his scent." Frank accepted the chair that Anna offered and rubbed his face with both hands. "When he charged me this afternoon, I got a good look at him. He's not just big, he's healthy, well-fed recently, which means he's been successful hunting somewhere else. This isn't a desperate bear looking for any food source he can find." "Then why is he investigating the village?" Anna asked. "That's what worries me," Frank replied. "A healthy bear that's actively hunting in human areas is either protecting something, following a specific scent, or demonstrating behavior that's outside normal patterns." Frank looked toward Liam, who had fallen asleep on the couch despite the adult conversation happening around him. "Thomas told me about the tracks near your house this morning. Has anything changed here recently? New food sources, different garbage disposal, anything that might attract a bear's attention?" Anna thought through the past several weeks, searching for anything that might have created unusual scents or signals. "Nothing different," she said. "Same routine, same food, same garbage pickup schedule." She paused as a thought occurred to her. "Although last week, Liam spilled a container of fish sticks outside when he was helping me bring in groceries. I cleaned it up, but maybe some residue remained." Thomas and Frank exchanged glances that suggested this information was significant. "Fish scent can linger for weeks, especially in cold weather," Thomas said. "Even trace amounts that humans can't detect will be obvious to a bear's sense of smell." He moved toward the window and adjusted the curtains slightly to peer outside. "That could explain why this bear keeps returning to investigate your property specifically." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of a vehicle approaching at high speed, followed by urgent honking that Anna recognized as the village's emergency signal. Thomas opened the door to find Samuel Olamon running toward them, his face showing the kind of panic that experienced Arctic residents rarely displayed. "Bear at the Nashhookpuk's house," Samuel gasped, breathing heavily from his sprint across the village. Trying to get inside, Mary and the kids are trapped in the back bedroom. David is there with his rifle, but the bear isn't backing off. Frank was on his feet immediately. How long ago? 5 minutes, maybe less, Samuel replied. We need everyone who can shoot. As the men prepared to leave, Thomas turned to Anna with an expression that conveyed both urgency and deep concern. Lock this door behind us, and don't open it for anyone unless you recognize their voice, and they specifically tell you the situation is resolved, he said. This bear has demonstrated that he's willing to investigate multiple houses in the same area. If he's finished at the Nashhook, he might come back here. After the men left, Anna locked the door and checked it twice, then moved through the house, ensuring that all windows were secure. She could hear shouting and the sound of vehicles moving quickly through the village, but the specific sounds were muffled by the wind and distance, making it impossible to determine what was happening at the Nashhook's house. Liam had awakened during the commotion and was now sitting up on the couch, rubbing his eyes and trying to understand why men with guns had been in their living room. "Mama, what's wrong?" he asked. Anna sat beside him and pulled him close, making a decision about how much truth a 6-year-old could handle. "The polar bear is bothering another family right now," she said. "The hunters are going to help them, and then hopefully the bear will go away." "Is the bear going to come to our house?" Liam asked with the direct curiosity that children apply to scary situations. "I don't know," Anna replied honestly. "But if he does, we're going to be very quiet and very safe inside our house until the hunters make him go away." They sat together on the couch, listening to the sounds from outside and trying to interpret what they might mean. Anna could hear intermittent shouting and what sounded like someone banging on metal, but no more gunshots, which she hoped meant that the situation was being resolved without violence. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes, the sounds gradually diminished, leaving only the constant wind and the occasional distant rumble of four-wheeler engines. Around 10 o'clock, Anna heard Thomas's vehicle returning alone. She recognized the specific engine sound and felt a wave of relief that suggested the crisis might be ending. Thomas knocked on her door with his familiar rhythm, but when she opened it, his expression was more serious than she had ever seen. "We chased him away from the Nashhook's house," Thomas reported, "but we didn't get him, and Mary said he spent almost 20 minutes trying different ways to get inside their house. This bear isn't giving up easily." Thomas entered and sat heavily in the chair he had occupied earlier. "Anna, I need to tell you something that might be difficult to hear." Anna felt her stomach drop. "What?" "This bear has focused on 2 houses specifically, the Nashhook's and yours," Thomas said. "Both houses have children, both are slightly isolated from the main cluster of village buildings, and both have shown evidence of the bear investigating the property multiple times." Thomas paused, choosing his words carefully. "Frank thinks this bear has identified specific targets and is demonstrating persistence that goes beyond normal food-seeking behavior." "What does that mean?" Anna asked, though she suspected she didn't want to know the answer. "It means this bear might not leave the area until he gets what he's looking for," Thomas replied. "And what he's looking for appears to be access to houses with children." The implication of Thomas's words hit Anna like a physical blow. She had read accounts of polar bears that developed preferences for specific types of prey, and while attacks on humans were rare, they were not unknown. A bear that had identified children as potential food sources and was demonstrating the intelligence and persistence to overcome human defenses represented a threat that went beyond normal wildlife encounters. "What do we do?" Anna asked. "Tonight you stay alert and prepared," Thomas said. "Tomorrow, if we haven't resolved this situation, we're going to evacuate you and Liam to Barrow until wildlife authorities can bring in additional resources to deal with this bear properly." Anna nodded, understanding that the suggestion of evacuation represented an acknowledgement that the situation had moved beyond the capability of local hunters to resolve safely. "How likely is it that he'll come back tonight?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "Very likely," he finally said. "This bear has been successful at finding human dwellings. He's been rewarded with interesting scents and potential food sources, and he hasn't been deterred by our attempts to chase him away." Thomas stood and moved toward the door. "I'm going to station myself at Samuel's house, where I can watch your property and the Naashukpuks at the same time. If you see or hear anything unusual, turn your porch light on and off 3 times. I'll be watching." After Thomas left, Anna went through their house one more time, checking locks and securing anything that might make noise if the bear investigated their property. She moved the bear spray from beside the door to the coffee table where she could reach it quickly, and she placed her largest kitchen knife on the counter where it would be easily accessible. The preparations felt both essential and absurdly inadequate against an animal that could break through their door without significant effort. Liam had dozed off on the couch again, exhausted by a day that had been filled with adult tension and disrupted routines. Anna covered him with a blanket and dimmed the living room lights, but she kept the kitchen and bedroom lights on to maintain the impression of normal human activity. She settled into the chair that provided the best view of both the front door and the window facing the direction from which a bear would most likely approach. The night passed slowly, with Anna dozing fitfully in her chair while remaining alert to changes in the sounds outside. The wind continued its relentless howling, creating a background noise that masked subtle sounds while amplifying her anxiety. Every creak of the house settling, every gust that rattled the windows, every distant sound from the village made her heart race as she tried to determine whether it represented normal Arctic night sounds or something more threatening. Around 2 in the morning, Anna was startled, fully awake, by a sound that was different from the background noise she had been monitoring. It was a rhythmic scratching or scraping that seemed to be coming from somewhere near the back of the house, in the area where their bedroom window faced toward the beach. Anna held her breath and listened carefully, trying to determine whether the sound was being made by wind moving loose materials or by something more purposeful. The scratching continued for several minutes, then stopped abruptly. Anna waited in complete silence, straining to hear any indication of what might have caused the sound. After 5 minutes of silence, she began to relax slightly, assuming that wind had been moving a loose piece of siding or roofing material. Then she heard breathing. It was a sound unlike anything Anna had ever heard. Deep and rhythmic, and unmistakably coming from a living creature of enormous size. The breathing was coming from directly outside their kitchen window, no more than 6 feet from where Anna sat frozen in her chair. She could hear each inhalation and exhalation clearly, suggesting that whatever was breathing was large enough to move significant amounts of air with each breath. Anna's mind raced through her options. The bear spray was within reach, but using it would require getting close to the window where the bear was apparently investigating their house. The kitchen knife was accessible, but seemed pathetically inadequate against an animal that could weigh 900 pounds. Her best option was to remain completely silent and hope that the bear would lose interest and move away. The breathing continued for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 3 or 4 minutes. Anna could hear subtle sounds that suggested the bear was moving around the outside of their house, investigating different windows and possibly testing the security of doors and other potential entry points. At one point, she heard a sound that might have been the bear standing on its hind legs to investigate their bedroom window, followed by what sounded like claws scraping against the glass. Liam stirred on the couch, mumbling something in his sleep, that seemed incredibly loud in the silence that Anna was trying to maintain. She held her breath, terrified that any sound might attract the bear's attention to the fact that the house contained living occupants. For several minutes, the sounds outside stopped completely, as if the bear was also listening for signs of activity inside the house. Then Anna heard the sound that she had been dreading since Thomas's first warning that morning. Heavy footsteps were moving toward their front door, accompanied by the kind of deliberate, purposeful movement that suggested intelligence and intention. The bear had completed its investigation of their house and was now approaching the main entry point with what seemed like a plan. Anna reached for the bear spray with trembling hands, her mind racing through everything she had been told about defending against polar bear attacks. The front door was solid and locked, but she had seen video footage of polar bears opening doors and breaking through barriers that seemed substantial. If this bear was determined to enter their house, the door might not be enough to stop it. The footsteps stopped directly in front of their door. Anna could hear the bear's breathing clearly now, deep and steady, and so close that it seemed to be coming from inside their house. Then she heard a sound that made her blood freeze. The bear was investigating their door handle, manipulating it with what sounded like deliberate curiosity about how the mechanism functioned. Anna gripped the bear spray and moved quietly toward the back of the house, staying low and trying not to make any sound that might alert the bear to her movement. Her plan was to get Liam and retreat to the bathroom, which Thomas had identified as their most secure room. But she needed to cross the living room where Liam was sleeping on the couch. As Anna moved toward her son, she heard the unmistakable sound of the door handle turning. The lock held, preventing the door from opening, but the bear had clearly figured out how the handle functioned and was now testing whether the door would open. Anna realized with terrifying clarity that the bear possessed the intelligence and determination to potentially overcome their defenses through systematic investigation and problem-solving. "Liam," Anna whispered, gently shaking her son's shoulder while keeping one eye on the front door. "Liam, we need to move very quietly to the bathroom." Liam opened his eyes, immediately alert in the way that children can be when they sense danger in adult voices. "Mama, what's wrong?" he asked in a voice that seemed terrifyingly loud in the silence. "The bear is outside our house," Anna whispered. "We need to go to the bathroom and lock the door until Mr. Thomas comes to help us." As Anna helped Liam off the couch, they both heard the sound that Anna had been hoping to avoid. The bear was now actively testing their front door, pushing against it with what sounded like significant force. The door held, but Anna could see it flex slightly under the pressure being applied from outside. They moved as quietly as possible toward the back of the house, Anna carrying the bear spray, while Liam followed close behind her. As they reached the hallway that led to the bathroom, Anna heard a new sound that made her realize their situation had become exponentially more dangerous. The bear had moved away from the front door and was now investigating their bedroom window with what sounded like focused determination. Anna hustled Liam into the bathroom and locked the door, then helped him climb into the bathtub, where he would be furthest from the window and most protected if the bear managed to break through. The bathroom was small and windowless, except for one tiny window that was too small for even a child to climb through, making it the most secure location in their house. "Mama, I'm scared," Liam whispered, his small body trembling as Anna settled beside him in the bathtub. "I know, sweetheart," Anna replied, pulling him close and trying to project calm while her own heart raced with terror. "We're safe in here, and Mr. Thomas is watching our house. He'll come help us soon." From the bathroom, Anna could hear the bear moving around the outside of their house with what seemed like systematic thoroughness. The sounds suggested that the animal was investigating every potential entry point, testing windows and doors with the kind of methodical approach that indicated intelligence and experience with human structures. Then Anna heard the sound that she had been dreading most. glass breaking. It came from the direction of their bedroom, followed immediately by sounds that indicated the bear was attempting to enlarge the opening it had created. Anna realized with horror that their sanctuary was about to be compromised by an animal that had demonstrated both the intelligence to solve complex problems and the determination to overcome obstacles that stood between it and whatever it was seeking. "Stay in the tub," Anna whispered to Liam, positioning herself between her son and the bathroom door while gripping the bear spray with both hands. "No matter what happens, stay down and don't make any noise." The sounds from the bedroom grew louder as the bear apparently succeeded in creating an opening large enough to enter their house. Anna could hear heavy footsteps moving through the bedroom, followed by what sounded like the bear investigating their closet and dresser with the same systematic approach it had applied to the exterior of their house. Anna's mind raced through what she knew about polar bear behavior in enclosed spaces. The animals were capable of moving surprisingly quickly despite their size, and they possessed strength that could easily overwhelm human defenses. Her only advantage was that the bear might not immediately recognize that humans were present in the house, giving her a brief opportunity to use the bear spray effectively if the animal discovered their location. The footsteps moved from the bedroom into the main living area, accompanied by sounds that suggested the bear was investigating furniture and other objects with apparent curiosity. Anna heard what sounded like the kitchen table being moved or knocked over, followed by the distinctive sound of the refrigerator door being opened. The bear had apparently discovered the kitchen and was now investigating potential food sources with the same methodical approach it had applied to entering the house. For several minutes, Anna listened to sounds that indicated the bear was thoroughly exploring their living space, apparently finding items of interest that held its attention. She hoped that the food in the refrigerator might satisfy whatever had motivated the bear to enter their house, allowing it to leave without discovering that humans were present. Then, the sounds stopped completely. Anna held her breath, listening for any indication of the bear's location or activity. The sudden silence was somehow more terrifying than the sounds of destruction had been, because it suggested that the bear might be listening for signs of human presence just as intently as Anna was trying to monitor the bear's movements. After several minutes of complete silence, Anna heard a new sound that made her blood freeze. The bear was moving through the house again, but now its movement seemed more purposeful and directed. The footsteps were heading toward the back of the house, toward the hallway where the bathroom was located. Anna gripped the bear spray and prepared to defend her son with whatever strength and courage she could summon. She had read that polar bears possessed an extraordinary sense of smell and could detect human scent even when people were concealed, making it likely that the bear would eventually discover their location regardless of how quiet they remained. The footsteps stopped directly outside the bathroom door. Anna could hear the bear's breathing clearly now, deep and steady, and so close that it seemed impossible that only a wooden door separated them from an animal that could kill them both in seconds. She held the bear spray ready and positioned herself to protect Liam, who remained curled in the bathtub with his eyes tightly closed. Then Anna heard the sound that confirmed her worst fears. The bear was investigating the bathroom door handle with the same systematic approach it had applied to the front door. The door was locked, but Anna realized that a lock designed to provide privacy against human intrusion would provide minimal protection against an animal that possessed both the strength to break through barriers and the intelligence to manipulate mechanisms. The door handle turned slowly, testing the resistance provided by the lock. When the door failed to open, Anna heard what sounded like the bear pushing against the door with increasing force. The door frame creaked under the pressure, and Anna could see the door itself beginning to flex as the bear applied its full weight to the problem of gaining entry. Anna made a decision that she hoped would give Liam the best chance of survival. As the bathroom door began to splinter under the bear's assault, she prepared to use the bear spray and then position herself between the animal and her son, hoping that she might be able to provide enough distraction to allow rescue to arrive or the bear to lose interest. The door gave way with a sudden crack of splintering wood, and Anna found herself face to face with the largest polar bear she had ever seen. The animal completely filled the doorway, its massive head nearly touching the top of the doorframe and its enormous body blocking any hope of escape. The bear's black eyes fixed on Anna with an intelligence that was somehow more terrifying than simple animal aggression would have been. Anna pressed the trigger on the bear spray, releasing a stream of capsaicin-based deterrent directly into the bear's face from a distance of less than 6 feet. The bear recoiled slightly and shook its head, but rather than retreating, it seemed to become more agitated and determined to enter the small bathroom. "Stay down!" Anna shouted to Liam as the bear pushed through the doorway, its massive body knocking chunks of the doorframe aside as it entered the bathroom. Anna continued to spray the bear while backing toward the bathtub where her son remained hidden, but the confined space left her with nowhere to retreat. The bear reached Anna in 2 steps, its massive paw striking her across the chest with force that lifted her off her feet and slammed her against the bathroom wall. Anna felt ribs crack under the impact, and her vision blurred as pain exploded through her body. The bear spray fell from her hands as she slumped to the floor, struggling to breathe and remain conscious. Through her fading awareness, Anna heard Liam screaming her name. She tried to respond, tried to tell him to stay hidden, but found that she couldn't draw enough breath to speak. The bear had turned its attention toward the bathtub, where Liam was now standing, his small body trembling with terror as he faced the massive predator that had just attacked his mother. Anna summoned every remaining bit of strength to launch herself toward the bear, grabbing its leg in a desperate attempt to divert its attention back to herself. The bear turned and struck her again, this time with enough force to send her crashing into the sink. Anna felt something break inside her chest, and warm blood filled her mouth as she struggled to remain conscious. The bear reached into the bathtub and grasped Liam with one massive paw, lifting the 6-year-old boy as easily as a person might lift a small dog. Liam's screams filled the small bathroom as the bear's claws punctured his clothing and the soft skin beneath. Anna watched in horror as her son struggled in the bear's grip, his small hands batting uselessly against the animal's massive paw. Anna tried to stand, tried to reach her son, but her body would no longer respond to her commands. She could feel herself losing consciousness as shock and blood loss began to overwhelm her system. Through the growing darkness, she could hear Liam calling for her, his voice becoming weaker as the bear's grip tightened around his small body. The last thing Anna saw before losing consciousness was the bear carrying her son out of the bathroom, moving through their destroyed house toward the hole it had created in their bedroom window. She tried to call out, tried to tell Liam that she loved him, but darkness claimed her before she could speak. Outside, Thomas Kanguk had heard the sounds of breaking glass and shouting coming from Anna's house. He immediately started his four-wheeler and began driving toward her property while radioing for every available hunter to converge on their location. As he approached the house, he could see the gaping hole in the bedroom window and could hear sounds that suggested the bear was still inside. Thomas parked his four-wheeler and approached the house on foot, his rifle ready, but his heart sinking as he realized that he was probably too late to prevent tragedy. The sounds from inside the house had stopped, suggesting that whatever had happened was already over. Frank Nashukpuk arrived moments later, followed quickly by Samuel Olamon and David Aknavigak. The 4 men approached the house carefully, weapons ready but uncertain what they would find inside. Through the broken bedroom window, they could see overturned furniture and scattered belongings that indicated the bear had thoroughly explored the interior of the house. Thomas entered through the front door while the others maintained positions outside. He found Anna unconscious, but breathing in the destroyed bathroom, her body showing clear evidence of a brutal mauling. Blood covered the bathroom walls and floor, and the door frame had been completely destroyed by the bear's entry. "Anna's alive!" Thomas shouted to the others. "But I don't see the boy!" Frank entered through the bedroom window and began searching the rest of the house, while Thomas checked Anna's injuries and tried to determine whether she was stable enough to be moved. Anna's breathing was shallow and irregular, and Thomas could see that she had suffered significant internal injuries that would require immediate medical attention. "Bear's gone," Frank reported from the living room. "Took the boy with him." Fresh trail leading toward the beach. Samuel immediately began coordinating rescue efforts, radioing for medical evacuation for Anna, while David and Frank prepared to follow the bear's trail. Thomas remained with Anna, applying pressure to her most obvious wounds, while monitoring her breathing and trying to determine whether she was regaining consciousness. Anna's eyes fluttered open as Thomas worked to stabilize her injuries. She immediately tried to sit up and began asking about Liam, but Thomas gently restrained her while explaining that they were organizing rescue efforts. "He took Liam," Anna whispered, her voice barely audible through the blood that filled her mouth. "The bear took my son." Thomas nodded grimly. "We're going to find him," he promised, though privately he understood that the chances of rescuing a 6-year-old child from a polar bear were virtually non-existent. Bears that carried away prey typically did so with the intention of consuming it immediately, and the animal's head start made pursuit extremely difficult in the dark Arctic landscape. Frank and David had already left to follow the bear's trail, accompanied by Samuel and 2 other hunters who had arrived with additional tracking equipment. The trail was clear in the snow, showing the distinctive paw prints of the massive bear, accompanied by what appeared to be drag marks where the animal had carried its prey. The medical evacuation helicopter arrived 30 minutes after Thomas's initial radio call, carrying a paramedic team equipped to handle trauma injuries in remote locations. Anna was stabilized and prepared for transport, while Thomas provided details about the attack and her injuries. As the helicopter prepared to depart for the hospital in Barrow, Anna grabbed Thomas's hand with surprising strength. "Find my son," she whispered. "Please find Liam." Thomas nodded, knowing that he would spend whatever time was necessary searching for the boy, even though his experience with polar bear behavior suggested that the search would likely end with the recovery of remains rather than a rescue. The tracking team followed the bear's trail for 3 hours through increasingly difficult terrain. The trail led away from the village toward the sea ice, where the bear's tracks became more difficult to distinguish from the natural irregularities of wind-packed snow. David Aknavigak, who was the most experienced tracker among them, noted that the bear was moving with purpose rather than the random wandering that might indicate it was simply carrying prey to a secure feeding location. "This bear knows where it's going," David reported to the others. "Trail is too straight, too purposeful for random movement." He paused to examine a particularly clear set of tracks. "And it's moving faster than I would expect for an animal carrying prey this size." Frank studied the tracks and the surrounding terrain, trying to determine whether the bear might be headed for a specific location that would provide security for feeding. Polar bears typically preferred isolated areas where they could consume prey without interference from other predators or scavengers, but this bear's behavior had been unusual from the beginning. Around 6 in the morning, as dawn began to provide enough light to improve tracking conditions, the search team made a discovery that changed their understanding of the situation completely. Samuel found evidence that the bear had stopped approximately 2 miles from the village and had remained in one location for an extended period, creating a disturbed area in the snow that suggested significant activity. "Over here," Samuel called to the others. "Something happened here." The hunters gathered around the disturbed area and began a careful examination of the evidence. What they found confirmed their worst fears while also creating new questions about the bear's behavior. There were clear signs that the bear had fed in this location, including bloodstains and scattered pieces of fabric that appeared to come from Liam's clothing. But David's experienced eye also noted details that didn't fit normal feeding behavior patterns. "This doesn't look right," he said, studying the disturbed snow and surrounding area. "Bear fed here, but not completely. Looks like it was interrupted or distracted by something." Frank found additional evidence that supported David's observation. The bear's tracks continued beyond the feeding site, but now they were accompanied by different markings in the snow that suggested the animal was dragging or carrying something significantly smaller than what it had brought to the location. "Frank," Thomas said quietly, pointing toward an area of disturbed snow about 20 yards from the main feeding site. "Look at this." Thomas had found what appeared to be a small depression in the snow, partially sheltered by a low ridge that provided protection from the wind. The depression showed signs of recent use, and there were traces of blood that appeared fresh rather than frozen from exposure to Arctic conditions. The hunters examined the site carefully, noting details that suggested a story different from what they had initially assumed. The blood traces were minimal, and there was evidence that something small had been placed in the depression deliberately rather than randomly dropped or abandoned. "Could the boy still be alive?" Samuel asked, voicing the hope that none of them wanted to express directly. David studied the evidence carefully before responding. "It's possible," he said finally. "This bear has been behaving unusually from the beginning. Maybe it's not following normal feeding patterns either." The discovery renewed their urgency, and the tracking team continued following the bear's trail with increased hope that they might be pursuing a rescue rather than a recovery operation. The trail led further onto the sea ice, where tracking became more difficult, but where the bear would also have fewer options for concealment. Thomas radioed their location and findings to the Village Coordination Center, requesting additional resources and medical support in case they were able to locate Liam alive. The response was immediate, with additional rescue teams being organized and a second medical helicopter being placed on standby. As the morning progressed, the tracking team noticed that the bear's trail was beginning to curve back toward land rather than continuing out onto the sea ice. This suggested that the animal might be seeking a specific location rather than simply trying to distance itself from the village, raising hopes that they might be able to predict its destination and potentially intercept it. Around 10 in the morning, Frank spotted movement in the distance through his binoculars. A large polar bear was visible approximately half a mile ahead, moving slowly across the ice in a direction that would bring it back toward the coastline. The bear appeared to be carrying something, but the distance and ice glare made it impossible to determine what the object might be. The tracking team immediately altered their approach, using natural features of the ice landscape to conceal their movement, while attempting to get close enough to determine the bear's exact location and the nature of what it was carrying. Radio communication was established with the Village Coordination Center, and additional resources were directed toward their position. Samuel, who had the most powerful binoculars, was able to get a clearer view of the bear as they closed the distance. "It's definitely carrying something," he reported to the others. "Something small, wrapped in what looks like fabric." The possibility that Liam might still be alive transformed the nature of their mission from recovery to rescue, requiring them to balance speed with caution to avoid actions that might provoke the bear to harm its captive. Thomas coordinated with the additional rescue teams that were approaching their position, developing a strategy for surrounding the bear while providing maximum protection for any hostage situation. As they moved closer, Frank was able to confirm what they had all been hoping to hear. "I can see movement," he reported. "Whatever the bear is carrying is still alive." The tracking team established positions that provided sightlines while maintaining enough distance to avoid alerting the bear to their presence. Through their binoculars, they could see that the bear had stopped near a natural depression in the ice and was investigating the area with apparent interest in establishing a temporary resting location. David, who had positioned himself with the clearest view, was able to provide more detailed information about what the bear was carrying. "It's the boy," he confirmed, wrapped in some kind of fabric, possibly his jacket or a blanket. "He appears to be moving, but I can't tell his condition from this distance." The rescue team coordinated their approach carefully, recognizing that they had only one opportunity to resolve the situation safely. The bear was alert and constantly scanning its surroundings, suggesting that it was aware of potential threats, even though it hadn't specifically detected the rescue team's presence. Thomas positioned himself with a clear shot, while Frank and Samuel moved to positions that would allow them to provide backup if the initial approach failed. David maintained his observation position to provide real-time information about the bear's behavior and Liam's condition. At precisely 11:15 in the morning, Thomas took the shot that ended the standoff. His rifle round struck the polar bear center mass, killing the animal instantly and preventing any possibility that it might harm its captive in response to the attack. The bear collapsed immediately, and the rescue team rushed forward to locate and assess Liam's condition. They found 6-year-old Liam Peterson, wrapped in his torn jacket, severely injured but alive. The boy had suffered multiple lacerations from the bear's claws and showed signs of hypothermia from exposure to Arctic conditions, but he was conscious and responsive when the rescue team reached him. Thomas immediately began first aid, while Frank radioed for the medical helicopter to proceed to their location. Liam was bleeding from several wounds and was showing signs of shock, but his injuries appeared to be survivable with immediate medical attention. "Mama," Liam whispered as Thomas worked to stabilize his condition. "Where's my mama?" "Your mama is safe," Thomas replied, applying pressure to the boy's wounds while monitoring his breathing and heart rate. "She's waiting for you at the hospital, and we're going to take you to see her right now." The medical helicopter arrived 20 minutes later, and Liam was prepared for transport with the same efficiency that had been applied to his mother's evacuation earlier that morning. The paramedic team noted that while his injuries were serious, the boy's youth and the cold conditions that had slowed his bleeding had probably saved his life. As the helicopter departed for Barrow with Liam aboard, the rescue team remained at the site to document the scene and begin the investigation into the bear attack. Wildlife authorities were already en route to examine the animal and determine what factors might have contributed to its unusual aggressive behavior. The bear that had terrorized Kaktovik was indeed massive, measuring nearly 10 feet in length and weighing an estimated 920 pounds. Initial examination revealed that the animal was healthy and well-fed, contradicting initial assumptions that hunger had motivated its aggressive behavior toward humans. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a wildlife biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, arrived in Kaktovik that afternoon to begin a comprehensive investigation into the attack. Her preliminary examination of the bear revealed several factors that might have contributed to its unusual behavior, including evidence of previous human contact and possible habituation to human food sources. This bear shows signs of having accessed human garbage or other food sources regularly, Dr. Walsh reported to the village leadership. Animals that become habituated to human-provided food often lose their natural wariness of people and may begin to actively seek out human dwellings as potential food sources. The investigation also revealed that the bear had been present in the Kaktovik area for at least 2 weeks prior to the attack, based on tracks and other evidence found throughout the village area. This extended presence suggested that the animal had been systematically investigating the community rather than simply passing through in search of natural prey. Anna Peterson underwent 6 hours of surgery at the hospital in Barrow to repair internal injuries sustained during the bear attack. Her injuries included 3 broken ribs, internal bleeding, and significant soft tissue damage, but doctors were optimistic about her recovery prospects. She remained unconscious for 2 days following the surgery, during which time Liam was treated for his wounds and hypothermia in the same medical facility. When Anna finally regained consciousness, her first question was about Liam's condition. Doctors were able to reassure her that her son was alive and recovering, though he would require additional surgery to repair damage to his left arm, where the bear's claws had caused significant tissue and nerve damage. The reunion between Anna and Liam took place 4 days after the attack, when both were stable enough to be moved to the same hospital room. Liam had been asking for his mother constantly since regaining consciousness, and Anna had been unable to rest properly without knowing details about her son's condition and recovery. "Mama, the bear was really big," Liam said, holding Anna's hand, while both of them remained connected to various medical monitoring equipment. "But I wasn't scared because I knew you would find me." Anna held her son close, overwhelmed by gratitude for his survival and by the realization of how close they had both come to death. The psychological impact of the attack was already becoming apparent, with both mother and son experiencing symptoms of post-traumatic stress that would require ongoing therapeutic intervention. Dr. Sarah Chen, a trauma specialist who worked with victims of animal attacks, began working with both Anna and Liam while they remained hospitalized. Her assessment indicated that both would likely experience long-term psychological effects from their encounter with the polar bear, including anxiety disorders, sleep disturbances, and possible phobic responses to situations that reminded them of the attack. Recovery from this type of trauma is typically a long-term process, Dr. Chen explained to Anna. "Both you and Liam will need ongoing support to help process what happened and develop coping strategies for managing the psychological impact." The attack had also created significant media attention, with news outlets from across North America covering the story of a polar bear that had demonstrated unprecedented aggression toward humans in an Arctic village. Reporters and camera crews began arriving in Kaktovik within days of the attack, seeking interviews with survivors and witnesses. Thomas Kanguk found himself serving as the primary spokesperson for the village, explaining to reporters the unusual nature of the bear's behavior and the community's response to the crisis. His decades of experience with polar bears provided credibility to his assessment that the attack represented an aberration rather than an indication of changing bear behavior patterns. "In 40 years of hunting polar bears, I never saw an animal behave like this one," Thomas told reporters. "This bear was different, more aggressive, more persistent, more willing to overcome obstacles to reach human dwellings." Thomas paused, choosing his words carefully. "What happened to Anna and Liam was terrible, but people shouldn't think that all polar bears are going to start behaving this way." Frank Nashukpuk provided additional perspective on the attack, describing his own encounter with the bear and the animal's unusual response to human presence. "Normal bears, when they see humans, they usually run away, or at least keep their distance," Frank explained. "This bear was actively seeking contact with humans, investigating our houses, trying to get inside our buildings. That's not normal bear behavior." The investigation by wildlife authorities continued for several weeks, with Dr. Walsh and her team conducting a thorough examination of factors that might have contributed to the bear's aggressive behavior. Their findings revealed a complex combination of environmental and behavioral factors that had created conditions for the attack. The bear's stomach contents revealed evidence of both natural prey and human-related food sources, including garbage and food scraps that had been improperly disposed of in the village area. This finding supported the theory that the animal had become habituated to human food sources and had lost its natural wariness of people. Climate data also revealed that sea ice conditions in the Beaufort Sea had been unusual during the weeks preceding the attack, with earlier breakup and reduced hunting opportunities for polar bears. These conditions had forced bears to spend longer periods on land, increasing the likelihood of human-wildlife conflicts. This attack appears to have resulted from a combination of factors, including habituation to human food sources, environmental conditions that force the bear to remain on land longer than normal, and individual behavioral characteristics that made this particular animal more aggressive than typical, Dr. Walsh concluded in her official report. The attack also prompted discussions about improving bear safety protocols in Arctic communities. Wildlife authorities worked with village leaders to develop enhanced guidelines for garbage disposal, food storage, and early warning systems that might help prevent similar incidents in the future. Anna and Liam remained hospitalized for 2 weeks while their physical injuries healed and they began the process of psychological recovery. During this time, they received visits from family members, village leaders, and support staff who helped them process the traumatic experience and plan for their eventual return to normal life. The question of whether Anna and Liam would return to Kaktovik remained unresolved during their hospital stay. Anna had built a life in the Arctic community and felt strong connections to the people and landscape that had become her home, but the attack had fundamentally changed her sense of safety and security in that environment. "I don't know if I can go back," Anna confided to Dr. Chen during one of their counseling sessions. "Every time I close my eyes, I see that bear in our house. I hear Liam screaming. I don't know how to feel safe there again." Liam's recovery progressed more quickly than his mother's, both physically and emotionally. Children often demonstrate remarkable resilience in recovering from traumatic experiences, and Liam seemed able to process the attack as something that had happened, rather than something that continued to threaten his safety. "The bear is dead now," Liam told his mother during one of their conversations about the attack. "Mr. Thomas shot it, so it can't hurt us anymore. Can we go home soon?" Anna was amazed by her son's ability to separate the past trauma from present reality, a psychological adaptation that she found herself unable to replicate. Her own recovery was complicated by persistent anxiety, intrusive memories, and a hypervigilance that made it difficult for her to relax, even in the secure hospital environment. Dr. Chen worked with both Anna and Liam to develop coping strategies and processing techniques that would help them manage the long-term psychological effects of their experience. This work included trauma-focused therapy, relaxation techniques, and gradual exposure to situations that might trigger anxiety responses. The legal implications of the attack were also considered during their recovery period. While polar bear attacks are typically viewed as natural disasters rather than incidents requiring legal resolution, the unusual circumstances of this case raised questions about potential liability and compensation issues. Marcus Peterson, Anna's ex-husband and Liam's father, arrived in Barrow during their second week of hospitalization. He had been notified of the attack shortly after it occurred, but had needed time to arrange travel from Anchorage and deal with his own emotional response to the near loss of his son. Marcus's presence created additional emotional complexity for Anna, who was already struggling to process her feelings about the attack and its aftermath. Their relationship had ended partly because of the stress and isolation of Arctic life, and the bear attack seemed to validate Marcus's concerns about the safety of raising a child in such a remote and potentially dangerous environment. "This never should have happened," Marcus said during a private conversation with Anna at the hospital. "Liam could have been killed. You could have been killed. How can you even think about going back to that place?" Anna found herself unable to articulate her connection to Kaktovik and the community that had supported her through the crisis. The attack had indeed demonstrated the very real dangers of Arctic life. But it had also revealed the strength and dedication of people who had risked their lives to rescue her and her son. Thomas Kanguk visited Anna and Liam during their final week in the hospital, bringing updates from the village and messages from community members who wanted to express their support. His presence seemed to provide Anna with a sense of continuity and connection to the life she had built in Kaktovik. "The whole village has been praying for you and Liam," Thomas told Anna. "Everyone wants you to know that you're part of our community, part of our family. Whatever you decide about coming back, we support you." Thomas's words helped Anna realize that her decision about returning to Kaktovik wasn't just about overcoming fear of another bear attack. It was about choosing between two different ways of life, two different sets of values, and two different definitions of community and security. The media attention surrounding their case continued throughout their hospitalization, with reporters requesting interviews and photographers seeking images that could illustrate the story of survival against impossible odds. Anna declined most media requests, wanting to focus on recovery rather than reliving the traumatic experience for public consumption. However, she did agree to one interview with a wildlife documentary producer who was creating an educational film about human polar bear interactions. Anna felt that sharing her story might help other people understand the realities of living in polar bear habitat and the importance of proper safety precautions. "People need to understand that polar bears are incredible animals, but they're also dangerous predators," Anna said during the interview. "What happened to us was unusual, but it shows why people who live in the Arctic have to take bear safety seriously every single day." The interview also allowed Anna to express her gratitude for the rescue efforts that had saved both her life and Liam's life. "Thomas Kanguk and the other hunters risked their lives to track down that bear and rescue my son," she said. "Without their courage and expertise, Liam would not be alive today." As their discharge from the hospital approached, Anna and Liam needed to make decisions about their immediate housing and long-term living arrangements. Marcus had offered them a place to stay in Anchorage while they continued their recovery, but Anna remained conflicted about leaving Kaktovik permanently. Dr. Chen recommended that Anna and Liam spend at least several months in a location where they could access ongoing psychological support before making permanent decisions about where to live. "Recovery from this type of trauma takes time," she explained. "It's important not to make major life changes while you're still processing the immediate effects of what happened." Anna ultimately decided to accept Marcus's offer of temporary housing in Anchorage, with the understanding that the arrangement would allow her to maintain her options regarding a potential return to Kaktovik. This decision provided stability for Liam's continued education and medical follow-up, while giving Anna time to work through her complex feelings about the attack and its aftermath. The day of their discharge from the hospital, Anna and Liam were met by Marcus and a small group of family members who had come to support their transition back to life outside the medical facility. The moment of leaving the hospital represented a significant milestone in their recovery, but it also marked the beginning of a new phase of dealing with the long-term consequences of their traumatic experience. As they prepared to board the flight to Anchorage, Anna looked back toward the north, toward the Arctic landscape that had been both their home and the site of their near-death experience. She felt a complex mixture of fear, loss, gratitude, and uncertainty about what the future would hold for her and Liam. "Mama, will we see Mr. Thomas again?" Liam asked as they settled into their seats on the airplane. "I hope so, sweetheart," Anna replied, holding her son's hand as the plane prepared for takeoff. "Someday, when we're feeling better, maybe we can visit Kaktovik and see all our friends there." The flight to Anchorage gave Anna time to reflect on the events that had changed their lives so dramatically. 3 weeks earlier, she had been a confident Arctic resident who understood the rhythms and dangers of life in polar bear country. Now, she was a trauma survivor, struggling to rebuild her sense of safety and security in a world that had revealed its potential for sudden, devastating violence. The bear attack had also created changes in Kaktovik that extended beyond Anna and Liam's personal experience. The village had implemented new safety protocols, including improved garbage management systems and enhanced communication procedures for reporting bear sightings. These changes were designed to reduce the likelihood of future human-bear conflicts, while maintaining the community's ability to coexist with polar bears in their shared Arctic environment. Dr. Walsh's investigation had led to recommendations for improved bear safety education and enhanced monitoring of bear populations in the Beaufort Sea region. Her research had also contributed to broader understanding of how climate change and habitat disruption might be affecting polar bear behavior patterns, information that could help other Arctic communities prepare for potential changes in human-wildlife interactions. The story of Anna and Liam Peterson's survival became part of the documented history of human polar bear encounters, providing valuable information for researchers, safety educators, and other people who live or work in polar bear habitat. Their experience demonstrated both the very real dangers of Arctic wildlife and the importance of community support systems in responding to crisis situations. Thomas Kanguk continued to serve as an advocate for improved bear safety education, sharing his knowledge of polar bear behavior with other Arctic communities and working with wildlife authorities to develop more effective strategies for preventing human-bear conflicts. His role in rescuing Liam had reinforced his reputation as one of the most skilled and experienced hunters in the North Slope region. The polar bear that had attacked Anna and Liam was preserved for scientific study, with samples of its tissue being analyzed to better understand its health status, genetic characteristics, and exposure to environmental contaminants. This research contributed to ongoing efforts to monitor polar bear population health and identify factors that might influence bear behavior. In Anchorage, Anna and Liam began the long process of rebuilding their lives while dealing with the ongoing effects of their traumatic experience. Anna found work with a non-profit organization that provided services to rural Alaska communities, allowing her to use her administrative skills while maintaining connections to the Arctic regions that remained important to her. Liam returned to school and gradually resumed normal childhood activities, though he continued to show signs of anxiety and hypervigilance that required ongoing therapeutic support. His physical recovery progressed well, with doctors optimistic that the nerve damage to his arm would not result in permanent disability. The question of whether Anna and Liam would eventually return to Kaktovik remained unresolved as they established their new life in Anchorage. Anna felt torn between her desire to return to the community that had become her home and her need to protect herself and her son from the psychological triggers that Arctic life might continue to present. Dr. Chen continued to work with both Anna and Liam through telephone counseling sessions that allowed them to maintain therapeutic support while adjusting to their new living situation. The therapy focused on helping them process their traumatic memories while developing confidence in their ability to assess and manage risk in their daily lives. Recovery from trauma is not about returning to exactly the way things were before, Dr. Chen explained to Anna during one of their sessions. It's about integrating the experience into your life story in a way that allows you to move forward with wisdom and strength. 6 months after the attack, Anna received a letter from Thomas Kanguk that provided updates on life in Kaktovik and expressed the community's continued support for her and Liam. The letter described the village's ongoing efforts to improve bear safety while maintaining their traditional relationship with the Arctic environment. "We miss you and Liam," Thomas wrote. "The village isn't the same without your family here. But we understand that you need to do what's best for you and the boy. Whatever you decide, you will always be part of our community." The letter also included drawings and messages from Liam's former classmates at the village school, expressions of friendship and support that demonstrated the strong connections that had developed during their years in Kaktovik. These messages helped Anna realize that their time in the Arctic had created relationships and experiences that would remain meaningful regardless of where they chose to live. As the anniversary of the attack approached, Anna found herself thinking more frequently about Kaktovik and the people who had saved their lives. She began to consider the possibility of returning for a visit, not necessarily to resume residence, but to demonstrate to herself and Liam that they could face their fears and maintain connections to the place that had been both dangerous and nurturing. "I think I'd like to see Mr. Thomas again," Liam told Anna one evening as they discussed the possibility of visiting Kaktovik. "I want to tell him thank you for saving me from the bear." Anna realized that returning to Kaktovik, even temporarily, might be an important step in their healing process. It would allow them to confront their traumatic memories in the actual location where the attack had occurred, while also reconnecting with the community that had supported them through the crisis. Dr. Chen supported the idea of a return visit, viewing it as a potentially therapeutic opportunity for both Anna and Liam to test their coping skills and demonstrate their resilience. "Returning to the site of a trauma can be very powerful," she explained. "It allows people to see that they have survived, that they are stronger than they thought, and that they can face their fears." Plans for the visit were made carefully, with Anna coordinating with village leadership to ensure that appropriate support would be available during their stay. The visit was planned for the summer months, when daylight was continuous and polar bear activity was typically reduced, providing the safest possible conditions for their return. 1 year after the attack, Anna and Liam returned to Kaktovik for a week-long visit that served as both a reunion with their Arctic community and a test of their ability to feel safe in the environment where they had nearly died. The visit was emotional and challenging, but it also provided closure and a sense of completion that helped both of them move forward in their recovery. Thomas Kanguk met them at the airstrip, and his presence immediately provided Anna with a sense of security and connection that reminded her why Kaktovik had felt like home. "Welcome back," Thomas said, embracing both Anna and Liam. "The whole village has been looking forward to seeing you again." The visit allowed Anna and Liam to see their former house, which had been repaired and now served as temporary housing for visiting researchers. Walking through the rooms where the attack had occurred was difficult, but it also helped them process their memories and realize that the physical space no longer held the same terror that had dominated their thoughts for the past year. Liam reconnected with his former classmates and spent hours playing and exploring the village with the kind of carefree energy that had been missing from his behavior since the attack. Seeing her son comfortable and happy in Kaktovik helped Anna recognize how much they had both lost when they left the community. During their visit, Anna and Liam also participated in a ceremony honoring the hunters who had risked their lives to track and kill the bear. The ceremony provided an opportunity for the entire community to acknowledge the trauma that had affected everyone and to celebrate the strength and courage that had prevented the loss of life. "Anna and Liam are part of our family," Thomas said during the ceremony. "What happened to them happened to all of us. Their survival is our survival. Their strength is our strength." The ceremony also included traditional elements that helped place the bear attack within the broader context of Arctic life and the relationship between humans and wildlife. Elders spoke about the importance of maintaining respect for polar bears, while also protecting human life, emphasizing the balance that had always defined life in the Arctic. As their visit concluded, Anna felt a sense of peace and resolution that had been missing from her life since the attack. She realized that while Kaktovik would always be associated with trauma, it was also connected to survival, community, and the kind of human connections that had saved their lives. "I'm glad we came back," Anna told Thomas as they prepared to return to Anchorage. "This place will always be part of who we are, part of our story." Liam had grown noticeably during their week in Kaktovik, not just physically but emotionally. He seemed more confident, more settled, as if returning to the place where he had survived something terrible had proven to him that he was stronger than his worst experiences. "Can we come back again next summer?" Liam asked Thomas as they stood together at the airstrip, waiting for their departure flight. "You can come back any time you want," Thomas replied, kneeling down to Liam's eye level. "This is your home too, no matter where else you live." The flight back to Anchorage gave Anna time to process the complex emotions that the visit had stirred up. She felt grateful for the opportunity to reconnect with Kaktovik, but she also felt ready to continue building their new life in a place where Liam could grow up without the constant awareness of predators that defined Arctic existence. Dr. Chen was eager to hear about their experience during their first counseling session after returning from Kaktovik. Anna described feeling a sense of completion, as if she had successfully faced her fears and proven to herself that the attack hadn't broken her fundamental sense of strength and capability. "The visit helped me realize that what happened to us was terrible, but it was also extraordinary," Anna explained. "Most people who get attacked by polar bears don't survive. Most children who get carried away by bears are never seen again. We lived through something that should have killed us, and that makes us incredibly fortunate." Liam's perspective on the visit was characteristically direct and optimistic. "I wasn't scared of the bears in Kaktovik," he told Dr. Chen. "I know they're still there, but I also know that Mr. Thomas and the other hunters know how to keep everyone safe." The successful return visit marked a turning point in both Anna and Liam's recovery process. They had demonstrated to themselves that they could face their traumatic memories and function effectively in challenging situations, proof that their psychological healing was progressing successfully. Anna began making plans for their long-term future with a clearer sense of what she wanted for herself and Liam. She decided to remain in Anchorage for the immediate future while maintaining strong connections to Kaktovik through visits and ongoing involvement in Arctic community issues. Her work with the non-profit organization expanded to include advocacy for improved safety protocols in rural Alaska communities, allowing her to use her personal experience to help other families prepare for wildlife encounters. This work provided meaning and purpose while also helping her process her own traumatic experience through helping others. Liam continued to thrive in his Anchorage school while maintaining connections to his Arctic heritage through cultural programs and summer visits to Kaktovik. His experience surviving the bear attack had given him a unique perspective on resilience and survival that influenced his relationships with other children and his approach to challenges. Marcus remained involved in Liam's life, and his relationship with Anna gradually improved as they worked together to provide stability and support for their son's continued development. The shared experience of nearly losing Liam had helped Marcus understand Anna's deep connection to Arctic life, while also reinforcing his concerns about safety and security. 2 years after the attack, Anna received an invitation to speak at a conference on human-wildlife conflict management, an opportunity to share her experience with researchers, wildlife managers, and other people who worked on polar bear conservation issues. She decided to accept the invitation, recognizing that her story could contribute to efforts to prevent similar attacks while maintaining coexistence between humans and polar bears. My experience shows both the dangers and the possibilities of living with polar bears, Anna told the conference audience. The attack was terrible, and it changed our lives forever. But it also demonstrated the importance of community preparedness, traditional knowledge, and the kind of courage that ordinary people can show when lives are at stake. Anna's presentation included detailed information about the attack sequence, the rescue operation, and the long-term recovery process, providing valuable insights for professionals who worked on wildlife conflict issues. Her perspective, as both a victim and a survivor, offered a unique viewpoint that complemented scientific research with lived experience. The conference also allowed Anna to meet other people who had survived wildlife attacks, creating connections and support networks that helped her continue processing her experience. She learned that her psychological recovery pattern was typical for trauma survivors, and that her ongoing anxiety and hypervigilance were normal responses to extraordinary circumstances. Liam, now 8 years old, had developed into a confident and articulate child who could discuss his experience with the polar bear in ways that demonstrated remarkable emotional maturity. His ability to integrate the traumatic experience into his life story without being defined by it impressed mental health professionals and provided hope for other families dealing with similar trauma. The bear was scary, but it's dead now, Liam explained to a researcher who was documenting long-term effects of wildlife attacks on children. I remember what happened, but I don't think about it every day anymore. Mostly, I think about normal kid stuff. Anna's advocacy work expanded to include collaboration with wildlife authorities on developing improved safety education materials for Arctic communities. Her first-hand experience with polar bear behavior provided valuable insights for creating realistic and practical safety guidelines that acknowledged both the dangers and the realities of Arctic life. The bear safety protocols developed with Anna's input were implemented in communities throughout polar bear habitat, potentially preventing future attacks through improved awareness and preparedness. This work gave Anna a sense that her traumatic experience had contributed to positive changes that could protect other families. Thomas Kanguk remained a regular correspondent, sending updates about life in Kaktovik and maintaining the connection that had become so important to Anna and Liam's sense of identity. His letters described changes in ice conditions, wildlife populations, and community developments that kept them informed about their former home. "The ice has been better this year," Thomas wrote in one letter. "Bears are staying out on the ice longer, finding more seals, not coming into the village as much. Maybe the changes we made to garbage handling are helping too." These updates helped Anna track environmental conditions that might affect polar bear behavior, information that contributed to her understanding of the factors that had led to their attack. She began to see their experience as part of a larger pattern of human-wildlife interaction that was being influenced by climate change and other environmental factors. 3 years after the attack, Anna was invited to join an advisory committee for a research project studying the effects of climate change on polar bears, bear behavior, and human-bear interactions. Her practical experience and understanding of Arctic life provided valuable perspective for scientists working on these complex issues. The research project included studies of bear population health, habitat changes, and human adaptation strategies in communities throughout the Arctic. Anna's role involved reviewing research proposals and helping ensure that studies addressed the real-world concerns of people who lived in polar bear habitat. Liam's interest in his Arctic heritage and wildlife conservation grew as he matured, influenced by his unique experience and his mother's ongoing work. He began participating in school science projects related to Arctic ecology and climate change, using his personal connection to polar bears to educate his classmates about conservation issues. Most kids think polar bears are just cute and fluffy, Liam told his class during a presentation about Arctic wildlife. But they're actually really powerful predators that can be dangerous to people. We need to respect them and protect their habitat, but we also need to be smart about staying safe. Anna was amazed by her son's ability to articulate complex ideas about human-wildlife coexistence, recognizing that his traumatic experience had contributed to an unusual level of maturity and understanding about environmental issues. She began to see their survival story as something that could inspire and educate others rather than simply a source of ongoing trauma. The 4th anniversary of the attack passed with little fanfare, marking a milestone in their recovery that demonstrated how successfully they had integrated the experience into their lives. Anna noticed that she could discuss the attack without experiencing the intense anxiety and physical symptoms that had characterized her early recovery period. Dr. Chen, who continued to provide occasional counseling support, noted that both Anna and Liam had achieved what psychologists call post-traumatic growth, psychological development that results from struggling with highly challenging circumstances. They had not simply returned to their pre-attack level of functioning, they had developed new strengths and perspectives that enhanced their lives. "You've both demonstrated remarkable resilience," Dr. Chen told Anna during one of their final regular sessions. "Your experience was terrible, but you've used it to develop wisdom, strength, and a sense of purpose that makes you better equipped to handle future challenges." Anna's relationship with Kaktovik continued to evolve, with annual summer visits becoming a regular part of their family routine. These visits allowed Liam to maintain connections to his Arctic heritage while providing Anna with ongoing opportunities to contribute to the community that had saved their lives. During one summer visit, Anna and Liam participated in a traditional hunt with Thomas and other village elders, an experience that helped them understand the broader context of human-wildlife relationships in Arctic culture. The hunt was successful, providing food for several families and demonstrating the sustainable use of natural resources that had defined Arctic life for generations. "Hunting isn't about killing animals," Thomas explained to Liam as they processed the caribou they had taken. "It's about understanding animals, respecting them, and taking only what we need to survive. The same respect applies to polar bears, even when they become dangerous." These cultural experiences helped Liam develop a sophisticated understanding of conservation that balanced human needs with environmental protection, a perspective that was informed by both traditional knowledge and his personal experience with wildlife encounters. Anna's advocacy work continued to expand, with speaking engagements and consulting opportunities that allowed her to influence policy decisions related to wildlife management and community safety. Her unique combination of personal experience, cultural knowledge, and professional skills made her an effective voice for Arctic communities. 5 years after the attack, Anna was offered a position with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, working on polar bear management and human-wildlife conflict prevention. The job would allow her to contribute professionally to issues that had become central to her life, while providing financial security for her and Liam. Accepting the position required moving back to northern Alaska, though not to Kaktovik specifically. Anna would be based in Utqiagvik, formerly Barrow, where she would work with communities throughout the North Slope region on wildlife management issues. The decision to return to the Arctic was not made lightly. Anna spent months discussing the opportunity with Liam, Marcus, Dr. Chen, and Thomas, weighing the professional opportunities against the psychological challenges of returning to polar bear habitat. "I want to go back to the Arctic," Liam told Anna when they discussed the potential move. "I miss the ice and the northern lights and all our friends in Kaktovik, and I think it would be cool if you got to work with polar bears for your job." Liam's enthusiasm for returning to the Arctic surprised Anna, who had assumed that he would prefer to remain in the safety and convenience of Anchorage. His eagerness to return suggested that he had successfully processed his traumatic experience and was ready to face the environment where it had occurred. Dr. Chen supported the move, viewing it as an opportunity for Anna and Liam to demonstrate their complete recovery from the trauma they had experienced. "You've both shown that you can function effectively in challenging situations," she said. "This move would prove to yourselves and others that you haven't been limited by your experience." Marcus was more cautious about the decision, concerned about exposing Liam to renewed risk in polar bear habitat. However, he ultimately supported Anna's choice, recognizing that her professional opportunity and Liam's cultural connections were important factors that outweighed his security concerns. The move to Utqiagvik took place during the summer, allowing Anna and Liam to establish themselves in their new community during the period of continuous daylight, when polar bear activity was typically reduced. Anna's new position involved extensive travel throughout the North Slope region, visiting communities and working with local leaders on wildlife management issues. Liam enrolled in the Utqiagvik school system, where his unique background and experiences made him something of a celebrity among his classmates. His survival story had become part of the documented history of human polar bear encounters, and his return to the Arctic as a confident and capable child inspired other young people. Anna's work with the Department of Fish and Game allowed her to influence policy decisions that affected communities throughout polar bear habitat. Her recommendations for improved safety protocols, community education programs, and research priorities were informed by both her personal experience and her understanding of Arctic culture. One of Anna's first major projects involved developing new guidelines for responding to aggressive polar bear encounters in village settings. The protocols she helped create incorporated lessons learned from her own attack, including the importance of rapid response, community coordination, and systematic tracking of bear behavior. The guidelines also emphasize the need for ongoing education about polar bear behavior and safety precautions, recognizing that effective prevention required community-wide understanding of wildlife risks and appropriate responses. Anna worked with traditional hunters like Thomas to ensure that the guidelines incorporated both scientific knowledge and traditional ecological knowledge. Thomas served as a cultural consultant for the project, helping to ensure that wildlife management recommendations were compatible with traditional Arctic lifestyle and values. His involvement also provided Anna with ongoing connection to Kaktovik and the community that remained central to her identity. "Anna brings something special to this work," Thomas told other community leaders during one project meeting. "She understands both the science and the reality of living with polar bears. She knows what it feels like to be afraid, and she knows what it takes to survive." Anna's professional reputation grew as her recommendations were implemented throughout the Arctic and proved effective in reducing human-bear conflicts. Her work contributed to improved safety in dozens of communities while maintaining the coexistence relationships that were essential to Arctic culture. Liam thrived in Utqiagvik, developing friendships with other children who shared his Arctic heritage and understood the unique aspects of northern life. His experience with the polar bear attack had given him a perspective on risk and survival that was unusual for his age, but it also demonstrated remarkable resilience and adaptability. "Liam is one of the most mature and thoughtful children I've ever taught," his fifth-grade teacher reported to Anna. "His experiences have given him insights that help him understand complex issues and relate to other people with unusual empathy." As Liam entered middle school, he began to express interest in wildlife biology and conservation as potential career paths. His personal connection to polar bears and his mother's professional work had sparked a fascination with ecology and environmental science that influenced his academic interests. Anna encouraged Liam's scientific interests while also ensuring that he maintained connections to traditional Arctic culture and values. She arranged for him to spend time with elder hunters and traditional knowledge holders who could teach him about sustainable relationships with Arctic wildlife. 6 years after the attack, Anna received recognition for her contributions to wildlife management and community safety in the form of a national award for excellence in human-wildlife conflict prevention. The award acknowledged both her professional achievements and her personal courage in transforming a traumatic experience into positive change for Arctic communities. Liam accompanied Anna to the award ceremony, where he was able to meet other conservation professionals and learn about career opportunities in wildlife biology and environmental science. The event helped him understand that his mother's work was part of a larger movement to balance human needs with wildlife conservation. "I'm proud of my mom for helping protect people and polar bears," Liam said during a brief interview at the award ceremony. "She shows that bad things can be turned into good things if you work hard and care about other people." Anna's acceptance speech focused on the importance of community-based approaches to wildlife management and the need to incorporate both scientific research and traditional knowledge in developing effective conservation strategies. She also acknowledged the role that trauma and survival had played in shaping her understanding of human-wildlife relationships. "My experience taught me that we can coexist with dangerous wildlife, but only if we respect both the animals and the knowledge that has allowed Arctic peoples to survive in this environment for thousands of years," Anna told the audience. The award and recognition brought new opportunities for Anna to influence wildlife policy at the national and international level. She was invited to participate in research projects, policy committees, and educational initiatives that extended far beyond Alaska to include polar bear habitat throughout the Arctic. These opportunities allowed Anna to share her unique perspective with scientists, policymakers, and communities in Canada, Greenland, Norway, and Russia, contributing to improved understanding of human polar bear coexistence throughout the circumpolar Arctic. Liam's interests continued to develop in directions that combined his personal experience with broader conservation goals. He began participating in science fairs and youth environmental programs that allowed him to share his knowledge about Arctic ecology with other young people. 7 years after the attack, Anna and Liam returned to Kaktovik for an extended summer visit that allowed them to participate in traditional cultural activities and contribute to community-based research projects. The visit demonstrated how completely they had integrated their traumatic experience into positive life outcomes. Thomas, now approaching 70, remained an active hunter and community leader, but he had begun to focus more on teaching traditional knowledge to younger generations. His work with Anna and Liam represented part of his broader effort to ensure that traditional ecological knowledge remained available to future generations. "Anna and Liam show us what it means to be strong," Thomas told the village council during their visit. "They faced something terrible and used it to become better people, better community members. That's what we hope for all our young people." The visit also allowed Anna to document traditional knowledge about polar bear behavior and hunting practices that could inform her ongoing professional work. This documentation project represented a collaboration between traditional knowledge holders and scientific researchers that produced valuable information for wildlife management. Liam, now 13, had developed the skills and confidence to participate meaningfully in traditional hunting activities, demonstrating his successful integration of multiple cultural influences in his personal development. His ability to bridge traditional and contemporary approaches to Arctic life impressed both elders and peers. Anna's work had evolved to include leadership roles in several national and international organizations focused on Arctic wildlife conservation and community development. Her unique background allowed her to serve as a bridge between different perspectives and approaches to conservation challenges. 8 years after the attack, Anna was selected to lead a major research initiative focused on predicting and preventing human-wildlife conflicts in the context of climate change. The project included communities throughout the Arctic and represented one of the most comprehensive studies ever undertaken of human polar bear interactions. The research initiative allowed Anna to return to Kaktovik as a professional researcher, bringing resources and expertise to the community that had saved her life. The circular nature of this return, from attack victim to community advocate to professional leader, represented a remarkable personal and professional transformation. Liam, now in high school, had begun to consider college options that would allow him to pursue wildlife biology or environmental science. His unique background and personal connection to conservation issues made him an attractive candidate for competitive programs, and his academic performance demonstrated his readiness for advanced study. Anna's professional success had demonstrated that traumatic experiences could be transformed into sources of strength and expertise, rather than simply endured or overcome. Her work had contributed to improved safety for thousands of people while advancing scientific understanding of human-wildlife relationships. 9 years after the attack, Anna received an invitation to establish a new research center focused on human-wildlife coexistence. With funding from multiple international organizations and government agencies, the center would be based in Anchorage but would work with communities throughout the Arctic. The opportunity represented the culmination of Anna's professional development and the complete transformation of her traumatic experience into positive contributions to conservation and community safety. Her story had become an inspiration for other trauma survivors and a model for effective wildlife management. Liam, now preparing for college, had decided to pursue a degree in wildlife biology with a focus on Arctic ecology and conservation. His personal experience and family connections had given him advantages in understanding complex ecological relationships and community-based conservation approaches. 10 years after the attack that nearly killed them both, Anna and Liam Peterson had transformed their survival story into a legacy of improved safety, scientific advancement, and community empowerment that would benefit Arctic peoples and polar bears for generations to come. Their journey, from victims to advocates to leaders, demonstrated the remarkable resilience of the human spirit and the possibility of creating meaning and purpose from even the most traumatic experiences. Thomas Kanguk, now retired from active hunting but still serving as a traditional knowledge advisor, continued to correspond with Anna and Liam, maintaining the relationship that had begun in crisis and had evolved into deep friendship and mutual respect. His role in their rescue had become part of village history, but his ongoing relationship with them represented something even more valuable: proof that trauma could be transformed into strength and that survival could become the foundation for service to others. The polar bear that had attacked Anna and Liam remained preserved in the museum collection at the University of Alaska, where it continued to contribute to scientific research on bear behavior and conservation. But the living legacy of their survival, the improved safety protocols, the enhanced community preparedness, the increased understanding of human-wildlife relationships, had proven far more valuable than any museum specimen. Their story had become part of the documented history of human survival, but more importantly, It had become a living example of how ordinary people could face extraordinary challenges and emerge not just intact, but transformed into forces for positive change in their communities and beyond. The next stories. Polar bear kills 55-year-old pastor during ice pilgrimage, January 19th, 2024. The Arctic wind howled across the Beaufort Sea ice shelf with a ferocity that seemed to strip away not just warmth, but hope itself. Pastor Richard Matthew Hughes pulled his snow goggles down against the crystalline assault of ice particles that felt like needles against any exposed skin. At 55, his weathered face bore the lines of 2 decades spent ministering in Alaska's most remote communities. But nothing had prepared him for the raw, primal terror that was about to unfold on this frozen wasteland 12 miles north of Utqiagvik, formerly known as Barrow, Alaska. Behind him, 30 members of his First Light Evangelical Church struggled against the howling wind, their colorful winter parkas creating a serpentine line of humanity against the pristine white expanse that stretched endlessly toward the North Pole. This was the 3rd day of what Hughes had christened the Ice Pilgrimage, a spiritual journey across the frozen Beaufort Sea that he believed would bring his congregation closer to God through shared hardship and the raw beauty of his creation. The temperature hovered at -38 degrees Fahrenheit, with wind chills plunging toward -60, cold enough to freeze exposed flesh in minutes and turn breath into ice crystals that tinkled like wind chimes as they fell to the snow. Hughes had been planning this pilgrimage for 18 months, ever since experiencing what he described to his wife Margaret as a divine vision during a particularly intense prayer session in his study. In that vision, he had seen Jesus walking across frozen waters, not the liquid seas of Galilee, but ice so thick and permanent it seemed like solid ground. The vision had been so vivid, so compelling, that Hughes had awakened Margaret at 3 in the morning to describe it, his eyes bright with evangelical fervor and his hands trembling with what he interpreted as divine inspiration. The pastor's flock consisted of a diverse mix of long-time Alaskans and newcomers drawn north by work in the oil industry, the promise of adventure, or simply the desire to disappear into America's last frontier. There was Martha Ellen Kowalski, 73, a retired nurse from Anchorage, whose husband had died in a fishing accident 5 years earlier, leaving her searching for meaning in her golden years. She walked with the determined gait of someone who had survived 7 decades of Alaska winters, her pale blue eyes constantly scanning the horizon with the wariness of someone who understood that the Arctic was beautiful but never benevolent. 20 yards behind, Martha walked Dr. James Christopher Davidson, a 42-year-old petroleum geologist from Houston who had transferred to the North Slope operations of BP Alaska just 8 months earlier. Davidson's wife Linda had filed for divorce 3 weeks before Christmas, citing his increasing obsession with Hughes's apocalyptic sermons and his growing distance from their 2 teenage daughters. He carried a professional-grade digital camera in an insulated case, documenting what he believed might be among the final days before Christ's second coming, which Hughes had predicted would occur sometime before the end of 2024. The group's youngest member was Sarah Marie Atkinson, 19, a sophomore at University of Alaska Fairbanks, studying wildlife biology, who had joined the church after experiencing what she described as a profound spiritual awakening during a near-fatal fall through thin ice while collecting samples for a research project the previous spring. Sarah's parents, both professors at UAF, had been horrified by their daughter's sudden evangelical transformation and her decision to join what they privately considered Hughes's increasingly radical interpretations of Scripture. She walked near the front of the group, her long blonde hair whipping from beneath her fur-lined hood, a digital voice recorder in her mittened hand as she documented her thoughts and observations for what she planned to submit as an independent study project, combining her scientific training with her newfound faith. Among the most devoted followers was Thomas Benjamin Carlyle, 68, a former oil rig supervisor who had lost his left leg below the knee in a blowout preventer accident on the Trans-Alaska Pipeline in 1987. Carlyle's prosthetic leg, designed for normal winter conditions, was beginning to malfunction in the extreme cold, causing him to limp with increasing severity as ice crystals formed in the mechanical joints. He had not mentioned his growing discomfort to anyone, viewing his suffering as a necessary component of spiritual purification. His wife Dorothy, 65, walked beside him with growing concern, occasionally reaching out to steady him when the wind threatened to knock him off balance. The expedition was guided by Tukumik Kanguk, a 47-year-old Inupiaq hunter and traditional knowledge keeper whose English name was Robert Kanguk. Tukumik had been reluctant to accept Hughes's offer of $5,000 to guide the group across the sea ice, not because of the money, which his family desperately needed, but because his grandfather's stories contained warnings about the increasing unpredictability of polar bears as climate change disrupted their traditional hunting patterns. The old stories spoke of bears that hunted humans not from hunger alone, but from a rage born of confusion and desperation as their ancient world literally melted beneath their massive paws. Tukumik carried a Winchester Model 70 rifle chambered in .375H and H Magnum, along with a satellite phone, GPS unit, and emergency shelter that could house 6 people in extreme conditions. He had insisted that Hughes sign a comprehensive waiver acknowledging the risks of polar bear encounters, hypothermia, falling through ice, sudden weather changes, and the simple fact that rescue might be impossible if conditions deteriorated rapidly. Hughes had signed without hesitation, his faith in divine protection absolute and unshakable. The pilgrimage had begun at dawn on January 17th, with the group gathering in the parking lot of First Light Evangelical Church as the aurora borealis painted the sky in sheets of green and purple light. Hughes had led them in prayer, his voice carrying clearly in the still air as he asked God to protect them during their journey and to reveal his glory through the magnificent desolation of the Arctic landscape. The temperature that morning had been a relatively mild -22 degrees, and several members of the group had commented on how beautiful and peaceful the northern lights appeared, taking their gentle movements as a sign of divine approval for their expedition. The first day had covered 8 miles across relatively flat sea ice, following traditional hunting routes that Tukumik's family had used for generations. The ice beneath their feet was between 4 and 6 feet thick, solid enough to support the weight of their group, but constantly creaking and groaning as thermal expansion and contraction created an ongoing symphony of mechanical stress that sounded like the earth itself was breathing. Hughes had paused frequently to deliver brief sermons about the nature of faith, using the harsh landscape as metaphor for spiritual trials and the beautiful but dangerous Arctic environment as evidence of God's awesome power. They had made camp the first night in a cluster of pressure ridges that provided some protection from the wind, setting up 4 expedition-grade tents designed for extreme conditions. The group had shared a meal of freeze-dried stew and hot tea brewed on portable camp stoves, their faces illuminated by headlamps that created an intimate circle of light in the vast darkness. Hughes had led evening prayers, and several members of the group had testified about feeling God's presence more intensely than ever before, describing a sense of spiritual clarity that seemed to increase with their distance from civilization. The second day had brought more challenging conditions as the wind picked up and the temperature dropped another 15 degrees. They had covered only 6 miles, struggling across rough ice formations created by the collision of ice floes during the previous autumn's freeze-up. Martha Kowalski had fallen twice, once hard enough to bruise her hip, but she had refused suggestions that she might want to turn back, insisting that God would provide the strength she needed to complete the journey. Dr. Davidson had begun experiencing mild symptoms of altitude sickness despite being at sea level, a psychosomatic reaction to stress and the extreme environment that he interpreted as spiritual purification. As they made camp the second night, Tukumik had quietly mentioned to Hughes that he had seen polar bear tracks crossing their route about 2 miles to the east. The tracks were relatively fresh, perhaps 12 hours old, from what appeared to be a large adult bear moving north toward the permanent ice pack. Hughes had thanked him for the information, but insisted that they would continue as planned, expressing complete confidence that divine protection would keep them safe from any wildlife encounters. Now, on the morning of January 19th, as they prepared to begin their 4th day on the ice, the weather had deteriorated significantly. The wind was gusting to 45 miles per hour, creating whiteout conditions whenever snow was picked up and hurled across the landscape like a horizontal blizzard. The temperature had dropped to negative 38 degrees, with wind chill values that would cause frostbite on exposed skin in less than 5 minutes. Tukumik approached Hughes as the pastor was conducting morning prayers with his huddled congregation, their voices barely audible above the howling wind. The Inupiaq guide's weathered face was grim with concern as he pulled Hughes aside for a private conversation, speaking close to the pastor's ear to be heard above the Arctic gale. "Richard, the weather is getting too dangerous," Tukumik said, his words creating clouds of vapor that were instantly torn away by the wind. "We need to turn back now before conditions get worse. I've been watching the sky, and there's a major storm system moving in from the northwest. We could be looking at negative 50 temperatures and 70-mile-per-hour winds by this afternoon." Hughes shook his head firmly, his eyes bright with the fervor that his congregation had come to recognize as a sign of absolute spiritual certainty. "Robert, God didn't bring us this far to turn back now. This is a test of faith, and I won't abandon these people when they're so close to experiencing His glory in its purest form. We continue north." Tukumik studied the pastor's face for a long moment, recognizing the futility of further argument. He had seen this kind of determination before in other outsiders who came to the Arctic with romantic notions about conquering the wilderness through sheer force of will, usually with tragic results. "Then we change route," he said finally. "Instead of heading directly north, we angle northwest toward that old DEW line station. It's only about 4 miles away, and there might be some shelter if the storm hits harder than expected." Hughes considered this compromise for a moment, then nodded his agreement. "Fine, but we don't stop there unless absolutely necessary. This pilgrimage has a specific destination, and I intend to reach it." As the group prepared to break camp, several members expressed private concerns about the deteriorating conditions. Dr. Davidson approached Sarah Atkinson, who was documenting ice formations with her camera, and spoke quietly enough that the wind would mask their conversation from other group members. "Sarah, I'm starting to think we should have turned back yesterday," Davidson said, his face pale with cold despite his expensive Arctic gear. "This weather is getting genuinely dangerous, and I'm not sure our pastor is making rational decisions anymore." Sarah lowered her camera and looked around at the desolate landscape that stretched endlessly in all directions, broken only by their small cluster of humanity and the occasional pressure ridge that rose like a frozen mountain range against the grey sky. "I know it looks scary, Dr. Davidson, but Pastor Hughes has never led us astray before. I mean, look where we are. This is literally the edge of the world. And we're experiencing God's creation in a way that maybe a dozen people ever have. That has to count for something spiritually. Davidson wasn't convinced, but he recognized the same absolute faith in Sarah's voice that he heard in Hughes's sermons, the kind of certainty that made rational argument impossible. He had joined the church during a period of personal crisis when his marriage was falling apart and his faith in human institutions had been severely shaken by corporate corruption at his previous job. Hughes's message of apocalyptic urgency and the need for complete spiritual surrender had resonated powerfully during that vulnerable time. But now, surrounded by hundreds of miles of potentially lethal wilderness, Davidson was beginning to question whether his spiritual awakening had been genuine revelation or simply psychological desperation. As they began moving across the ice in single file, with Tukumik leading and Hughes bringing up the rear to ensure no one fell behind, the wind continued to increase in intensity. The snow beneath their feet had been scoured to a hard, crystalline surface that reflected what little light penetrated the heavy cloud cover, creating an environment so bright it was necessary to wear protective eyewear to prevent snow blindness. Martha Kowalski was beginning to struggle with the pace, her 73-year-old body no longer able to generate enough heat to keep up with the group's movement across the difficult terrain. She had developed a persistent cough that worried her, but which she attributed to the dry Arctic air rather than anything more serious. Behind her, Thomas Carlyle's prosthetic leg was causing increasing problems, the mechanical joints seizing periodically in the extreme cold and forcing him to stop and manually manipulate the device to restore mobility. About 2 hours into their march, as they navigated around a particularly large pressure ridge that rose nearly 20 feet above the surrounding ice, Tukumik suddenly stopped and held up his hand in a signal for complete silence. The group bunched together behind him, their breathing creating a small cloud of vapor that was immediately dispersed by the relentless wind. "What is it?" Hughes whispered, moving forward to stand beside their guide. Tukumik pointed toward a series of depressions in the snow about 50 yards ahead, barely visible in the swirling ice crystals, but unmistakably the tracks of a large polar bear. The prints were enormous, each paw print nearly a foot in diameter and showing the distinctive claw marks that indicated an adult male bear of considerable size. More disturbing was the fact that the tracks appeared to be following their route, as if the bear had been shadowing their movement for some time. "How fresh are they?" Hughes asked, though he was beginning to understand that his lack of wilderness experience made such questions largely meaningless. "Maybe 2 hours," Tukumik replied quietly, unshouldering his rifle and checking that a round was chambered. "This is a big male, probably 800 pounds or more. He's been following us since we broke camp this morning." Several members of the group had overheard this exchange, and word quickly spread through their ranks that they were being stalked by a polar bear. Sarah Atkinson felt her pulse quicken with a mixture of fear and excitement, recognizing this as exactly the kind of spiritual test that Hughes had predicted they would face during their pilgrimage. Dr. Davidson, however, felt his stomach clench with genuine terror as he realized they were being hunted by one of the planet's most effective predators in its natural habitat, where humans were at every possible disadvantage. "Should we turn back?" asked Dorothy Carlyle, her voice tight with concern for her husband, whose mobility issues would make him particularly vulnerable in any emergency situation. Hughes shook his head emphatically. "Absolutely not. This is exactly what we came here for, to face our fears and trust completely in God's protection. Robert, how dangerous is this bear really?" Tukumik looked at the pastor with something approaching amazement at the man's naivety about Arctic wildlife. "Richard, a polar bear is the most dangerous land predator in North America. They're not afraid of humans like other bears. To them, we're just another food source. A male this size could kill our entire group in about 5 minutes if he decided to attack. But he hasn't attacked, Hughes pointed out with the kind of logic that worked well in theological debates but had limited application to wildlife behavior. That means God is protecting us, just as I knew he would. We continue north, but we stay closer together and keep our eyes open. This decision prompted a heated discussion among group members about the wisdom of continuing their journey in the face of a clear predator threat. Dr. Davidson was joined by several others in arguing for an immediate return to Utqiagvik, while Hughes' most devoted followers, including Sarah Atkinson and a cluster of elderly congregation members who viewed the bear as a divinely ordained test of faith, insisted that turning back would represent a failure of spiritual courage. The debate was resolved when Martha Kowalski collapsed suddenly, her legs simply giving out as she attempted to take another step forward. She fell heavily to the ice, her breathing labored and her face an alarming shade of grey that indicated serious circulatory problems. Dr. Davidson and several others immediately surrounded her, checking vital signs and trying to determine whether she was experiencing a medical emergency or simple exhaustion. "Her pulse is rapid and thready," reported Janet Morrison, a 45-year-old registered nurse who worked at the Utqiagvik Health Clinic. "She's showing signs of moderate hypothermia, and I think she may be developing pulmonary edema from the extreme cold and exertion." This medical crisis forced Hughes to make a practical decision that superseded his spiritual concerns. They would have to establish an emergency shelter and warm Martha up before continuing, which meant remaining in one location for at least an hour while being stalked by a polar bear. Tukumik immediately began unpacking an emergency bivvy shelter designed for exactly this kind of situation, while other group members formed a protective circle around Martha and Janet as they worked to stabilize her condition. As they worked to set up the emergency shelter, the wind continued to increase in intensity, and the first fat snowflakes of what promised to be a major Arctic storm began falling from the grey sky. The temperature was dropping steadily, now approaching -40 degrees, with wind chills that made exposed skin burn with cold within seconds. It was during this vulnerable moment, as the group was focused on medical care and shelter construction, that the polar bear made its appearance. The massive animal emerged from behind a pressure ridge approximately 100 yards to the northeast, moving with the deceptive grace of a creature that weighed nearly half a ton, but could accelerate to 35 miles per hour in seconds. The bear's yellowish-white coat was perfectly adapted to the Arctic environment, making it nearly invisible against the ice and snow until it chose to reveal itself. Its black nose and eyes stood out starkly against its pale fur, and its massive head swayed slightly from side to side as it tested the air for scent information about these strange creatures that had entered its territory. Sarah Atkinson was the first to spot the bear, her wildlife biology training allowing her to recognize the animal's distinctive silhouette even at a distance. "Polar bear," she said quietly, her voice carrying clearly in the still air between wind gusts. "Northeast, about 100 yards." The effect on the group was immediate and profound. Several people screamed, others began praying aloud, and a few simply froze in place, their minds unable to process the reality of being confronted by one of nature's most efficient killing machines. The bear's response to these sounds was equally immediate. Its massive head snapped toward their location, and it rose onto its hind legs to get a better view of potential prey, revealing its full 8-foot height and truly enormous size. Tukumik raised his rifle and took aim at the bear, but at this distance, and with the wind conditions, a clean shot would be difficult and potentially dangerous to group members if he missed. "Everyone stay calm," he called out, his voice steady despite the extreme danger they faced. "Move slowly toward the shelter, but don't run. Running will trigger its chase instinct." Hughes, however, had a different interpretation of the situation. As the bear dropped back to all fours and began walking slowly but deliberately toward their group, the pastor stepped forward with his arms raised toward heaven, his voice carrying clearly across the ice as he began to pray with the fervor of someone experiencing a profound spiritual revelation. Lord God, we thank you for sending this magnificent creature to test our faith, Hughes called out, his words seeming to hang in the frigid air. We trust in your protection and your divine plan for our lives. If it is your will that we face this trial, then we face it with joy and complete surrender to your wisdom. The bear's response to Hughes' voice was immediate and alarming. The animal stopped its approach and stood motionless for several seconds, its massive head tilted slightly, as if listening to sounds it had never heard before. Then, with terrifying suddenness, it began moving toward them again, but now its gait had changed from curious investigation to purposeful hunting behavior. "Richard, get back here right now," Tukumik shouted, tracking the bear with his rifle sight while trying to position himself for the best possible shot angle. "That bear is starting to see us as prey." But Hughes seemed to be experiencing some kind of religious ecstasy, his arms still raised toward the grey sky as he continued praying aloud, apparently oblivious to the mortal danger approaching at increasing speed. "We are your servants, Lord, and we place our lives completely in your hands. Use us as you see fit for your glory." The bear was now 50 yards away and covering ground with increasing speed, its massive paws hitting the ice with sounds like muffled thunder. Its black eyes were fixed directly on Hughes, and experienced Arctic hunters would have recognized the distinctive gait and posture that indicated a polar bear in active hunt mode, no longer investigating, but committed to attack. Several group members were screaming at Hughes to move away from the bear, while others had begun running toward the partially constructed emergency shelter, abandoning the original plan to move slowly and avoid triggering the animal's chase instinct. Dr. Davidson was helping Janet Morrison support Martha Kowalski as they tried to reach safety, while Sarah Atkinson found herself torn between fleeing and documenting what she was beginning to realize might be an unprecedented wildlife encounter. Thomas Carlyle, hampered by his malfunctioning prosthetic leg, fell heavily to the ice as he attempted to move toward shelter, his wife Dorothy stopping to help him up despite the approaching danger. The sound of Thomas hitting the ice seemed to galvanize the bear's attention, causing it to pause momentarily and assess this new stimulus before refocusing on Hughes, who remained standing with his arms raised in apparent spiritual rapture. At 30 yards, Tukumik made the decision to fire a warning shot, hoping to frighten the bear away without having to kill it. The shot rang out across the ice like thunder, the sound echoing off nearby pressure ridges and seeming to hang in the frigid air. For a moment, the bear stopped and looked toward the source of the noise, its expression appearing almost puzzled by this unfamiliar sound. Then, with devastating suddenness, the warning shot had exactly the opposite effect from what Tukumik had intended. Instead of frightening the bear away, the loud noise seemed to trigger its final commitment to attack, and the massive animal launched itself forward with explosive speed, covering the final 30 yards to Hughes in less than 6 seconds. Hughes had just enough time to lower his arms and look directly at the approaching bear before 800 pounds of Arctic predator slammed into him with the force of a small vehicle. The impact knocked the pastor backwards onto the ice with a sickening crunch that could be heard clearly above the wind. And then the bear was on top of him, its massive jaws closing around his head and neck with hydraulic pressure that exceeded 1,500 pounds per square inch. The attack was swift, brutal, and absolutely decisive. Hughes' body went limp immediately as the bear's teeth penetrated his skull, and bright red blood began spreading across the white ice in an expanding circle that seemed to pulse with each beat of his rapidly failing heart. The bear shook its massive head from side to side, the way a dog might shake a toy, and the sound of breaking bones was audible to the horrified witnesses, despite their distance and the howling wind. Sarah Atkinson, her scientific training warring with her horror and disbelief, found herself automatically documenting the attack with her camera, the motor drive whirring as she captured frame after frame of the most brutal wildlife encounter most people would ever witness. Her hands shook so violently that many of the images would later prove to be blurred beyond recognition, but several frames captured the attack with devastating clarity that would later prove crucial for wildlife authorities investigating the incident. Dr. Davidson had reached the emergency shelter and was trying to help Janet Morrison get Martha Kowalski inside when he heard the distinctive sounds of the attack beginning. He turned to see Hughes disappearing beneath the massive bear, and his mind simply shut down, unable to process the reality of watching someone he knew being killed and partially consumed by a wild animal. He would later describe the next few minutes as existing in a kind of dissociative fog, where he could see and hear everything, but felt completely disconnected from the events unfolding around him. Tecumseh was faced with an impossible decision. He could potentially kill the bear with a well-placed shot, but Hughes was almost certainly already dead, and firing at the animal while it was directly on top of the pastor's body risked hitting Hughes or causing the bear to redirect its attention toward other group members. Instead, he began shouting and firing shots into the air, hoping to drive the bear away from Hughes's body before it decided to investigate the other humans clustered around the emergency shelter. The bear's response was to raise its bloody muzzle from Hughes's mangled body and look directly toward the source of the noise, its dark eyes seeming to assess whether these other creatures represented additional prey or potential threats. Blood dripped from its jaws onto the white ice, creating a pattern of red spots that would later be photographed extensively by investigation teams. For several seconds that felt like hours to the traumatized witnesses, the bear simply stared at the group of humans huddled around their inadequate shelter. Its breathing was visible as clouds of vapor in the extreme cold, and its massive chest rose and fell with the rhythm of an apex predator that had just made a successful kill but was still evaluating its environment for additional opportunities or threats. Then, with the same suddenness that had characterized its attack on Hughes, the bear seemed to lose interest in the remaining humans. It lowered its head back to the pastor's body and began feeding, tearing away large pieces of flesh and clothing with casual efficiency that spoke to millions of years of evolutionary adaptation for exactly this kind of predatory behavior. The sound of the bear feeding on Hugh's body was something that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. It was not the dramatic growling and roaring that movies had conditioned them to expect, but rather a series of wet, tearing sounds punctuated by the bear's heavy breathing and the occasional crack of breaking bones. The animal fed with methodical efficiency, pausing occasionally to look around, but showing no further interest in the surviving humans as long as they remained motionless and quiet. Dorothy Carlyle had managed to help her husband Thomas reach the emergency shelter, but both of them were in severe shock, their faces blank with the kind of trauma that occurs when the mind witnesses something so far beyond normal human experience that it simply stops processing information normally. Dorothy kept repeating, "Oh God, oh God, oh God," in a barely audible whisper, while Thomas stared at the feeding bear with the fixed gaze of someone whose reality had fundamentally changed in the span of a few seconds. Janet Morrison was trying to treat Martha Kowalski for hypothermia and shock while simultaneously dealing with her own psychological response to witnessing the attack. Her medical training provided some framework for remaining functional under extreme stress, but nothing in her experience had prepared her for watching someone she knew being killed and eaten by a wild animal. Her hands shook as she checked Martha's vital signs, and she found herself fighting waves of nausea that threatened to overwhelm her professional composure. The feeding continued for approximately 20 minutes, during which time the survivors huddled in their inadequate shelter and tried to come to terms with what they had witnessed. The bear consumed an estimated 30 to 40 pounds of tissue and organs, focusing primarily on the torso and internal organs that provided the highest caloric content. Hughes's face was largely intact, his eyes still open and staring at the grey sky with an expression that several survivors later described as peaceful, as if he had achieved the spiritual transcendence he had been seeking. When the bear finally finished feeding, it stood up and looked once more at the group of surviving humans, blood still dripping from its muzzle onto the ice. For a moment, it seemed to consider investigating them more closely, taking several steps in their direction before apparently deciding that they represented more effort than they were worth. With remarkable grace for such a massive animal, it turned and began walking away toward the northwest, disappearing behind a pressure ridge with the same supernatural stealth that had characterized its initial approach. The silence that followed the bear's departure was broken only by the continued howling of the Arctic wind and the quiet sobbing of several group members who were beginning to process the full horror of what they had experienced. Sarah Atkinson lowered her camera with hands that shook so violently she could barely maintain her grip on the device, her scientific objectivity finally giving way to the emotional reality of having watched her pastor and spiritual mentor being killed and partially consumed in front of her eyes. Dr. Davidson was the first to speak, his voice hoarse and unsteady as he tried to assess their current situation. "Is everyone else okay? Is anyone injured, besides Martha?" A quick roll call revealed that all 29 surviving members of the pilgrimage were physically unharmed, though several were showing signs of severe psychological shock. Martha Kowalski's condition had actually improved slightly during the attack, as the adrenaline surge had temporarily increased her circulation and body temperature, though she remained in need of immediate medical attention. Tukumik immediately began setting up his satellite phone to contact emergency services, knowing that their survival now depended on rapid evacuation before the approaching storm system made rescue impossible. The irony was not lost on anyone that Hughes had refused to turn back because of weather conditions, and now those same conditions threatened to trap them with a polar bear that had learned to associate their location with an easy meal. The emergency call went through to the North Slope Borough Search and Rescue Coordination Center in Utqiagvik at 1:47 p.m. Alaska Standard Time. The duty officer who took the call was Lieutenant Sarah Nashaknik, a 28-year-old Inupiaq woman who had coordinated dozens of Arctic rescue operations but had never dealt with a fatal polar bear attack. "This is Utqiagvik SAR. What's the nature of your emergency?" Nashaknik's voice was calm and professional, trained to extract critical information quickly from panicked callers. Tukumik's voice was steady but tense as he provided the essential details. "This is Robert Kanguk, calling from coordinates 71.427 north, 156.891 west. We have a group of 30 people on sea ice about 12 miles north of Utqiagvik. We've had a fatal polar bear attack with one confirmed death, and we have severe weather moving in. We need immediate evacuation for 29 survivors, including one person requiring medical attention for hypothermia." Lieutenant Nashaknik was already pulling up weather data and rescue resources as Tukumik provided the details. "Robert, I'm showing your location on GPS. Wind conditions are marginal for helicopter operations, and we've got a major storm system moving in from the northwest. Can you give me more details about the bear attack and your current security situation?" "The bear killed Pastor Richard Hughes about 30 minutes ago," Tukumik replied, his voice remaining remarkably controlled given the circumstances. The animal fed on the body and then moved away to the northwest, but it could return at any time. We have minimal shelter for the group, and several people are showing signs of shock and hypothermia. If we don't get evacuated in the next few hours, we're going to have more casualties. Nashanik was already coordinating with multiple agencies as she spoke. Robert, I'm dispatching 2 helicopters from our base, plus a backup ground team with snow machines in case weather prevents air evacuation. We're also alerting the Alaska State Troopers and Fish and Wildlife Service about the bear attack. Can you maintain your current position, or do you need to move for safety reasons? We'll hold position unless the bear returns, Tukumik replied. But if this storm hits before you get here, you won't be able to find us until it passes, and that could be days. Understood. Our ETA is approximately 45 minutes for the first helicopter, assuming wind conditions don't deteriorate further. Keep this channel open and give me updates every 10 minutes on your status and weather conditions. As rescue operations began mobilizing in Utqiagvik, the survivors faced the grim task of dealing with Hughes' remains while preparing for evacuation. The pastor's body had been severely mauled and partially consumed, presenting both practical and psychological challenges for a group of people who were already traumatized beyond anything they had previously experienced. Sarah Atkinson, drawing on her biology training and perhaps seeking some way to make sense of the tragedy through scientific observation, approached Hughes' remains to document the extent of the damage. What she found would later provide crucial evidence for wildlife authorities investigating the attack, but the immediate impact on her psychological state was devastating. Hughes's body had been dragged approximately 15 feet from where the initial attack occurred, leaving a clear blood trail across the white ice. The bear had focused its feeding on the torso and internal organs, opening the abdominal cavity and consuming most of the liver, lungs, and other high-energy organ meat. The pastor's face was largely untouched, maintaining an expression that several witnesses described as serene, almost peaceful, despite the violence of his death. More disturbing to the survivors was the clinical efficiency of the attack and feeding behavior, which contradicted popular misconceptions about bears as savage, mindless killers. This bear had demonstrated sophisticated predatory behavior, stalking them for hours before selecting the most vulnerable target and executing a precise, devastating attack that minimized its own risk while maximizing its caloric gain. The feeding had been methodical and selective, focusing on the most nutritious tissues while avoiding less palatable materials like clothing and hair. Dr. Davidson, who had some experience with industrial accidents and traumatic injuries from his work in oil field operations, took on the difficult task of preparing Hughes' remains for transport. Using materials from their emergency supplies, he managed to wrap the body in a tarp and sleeping bag, creating a makeshift body bag that would preserve dignity while facilitating helicopter evacuation. The psychological impact on the group during this process was severe and varied. Several people were unable to look at Hughes's remains, turning away and focusing on other tasks or simply staring at the horizon in stunned silence. Others, including Martha Kowalski, despite her hypothermia, insisted on participating in prayers and brief memorial services, viewing this as their final opportunity to honor their pastor's memory before his body was removed from the ice where he had died. Thomas Carlyle's reaction was perhaps the most complex and troubling. Despite his mobility issues and the obvious danger of remaining on the ice, he expressed a desire to stay with Hughes's body, arguing that abandoning their pastor on the frozen sea would constitute a betrayal of everything the man had stood for. His wife, Dorothy, was forced to physically restrain him from approaching the remains, and their argument became heated enough that other group members had to intervene to prevent further disruption during an already chaotic situation. Meanwhile, the weather continued to deteriorate rapidly. The wind had increased to sustained speeds of 50 miles per hour, with gusts exceeding 60, and the snow had changed from scattered flakes to a dense horizontal curtain that reduced visibility to less than 50 yards. The temperature had dropped to -42 degrees Fahrenheit, with wind chills approaching -70, cold enough to cause frostbite on exposed skin in less than 2 minutes. Tecumseh monitored weather conditions and maintained radio contact with rescue coordinators while helping group members prepare for helicopter evacuation. His decades of Arctic experience told him that they were rapidly approaching the limits of safe helicopter operations, and he began preparing contingency plans for surviving on the ice if air rescue became impossible. The first rescue helicopter, a Bell 212 twin-engine aircraft operated by the North Slope Borough, appeared through the blowing snow at 2:31 p.m., its distinctive rotor noise audible above the wind long before the aircraft became visible. The pilot, Captain Maria Santos, was a 15-year veteran of Arctic rescue operations who had evacuated hundreds of people from remote locations. But she had never attempted a rescue in conditions this marginal, with a polar bear threat complicating the operation. Landing conditions on the sea ice were extremely challenging due to wind conditions and the risk of rotor wash creating a whiteout that could cause spatial disorientation or collision with ice formations. Captain Santos made 2 approach attempts before successfully touching down approximately 100 yards from the survivor group, her aircraft rocking violently in the wind as the rotors continued turning to maintain immediate takeoff capability if conditions deteriorated further. The helicopter could safely transport 8 people per trip under normal conditions, but the extreme weather and need to accommodate Hughes' remains reduced that number to 6 survivors, plus the body. Tecumseh made the difficult decision about evacuation priorities, selecting Martha Kowalski and Janet Morrison for medical reasons, Dorothy and Thomas Carlyle due to Thomas's mobility issues, and Dr. Davidson and Sarah Atkinson as the 2 most psychologically affected by witnessing the attack. Loading the survivors and Hughes' remains into the helicopter required working in conditions that were genuinely life-threatening for anyone not wearing complete Arctic survival gear. The rotor wash created a localized blizzard that made navigation difficult and posed the risk of people becoming disoriented and walking into the tail rotor or main rotor disc. The sound was deafening, making communication impossible except through hand signals and physical contact. Martha Kowalski had to be carried to the aircraft on an improvised stretcher, her hypothermia having progressed to the point where she was no longer able to walk unassisted. Janet Morrison accompanied her to provide medical care during transport, though both women were so traumatized by the bear attack that their effectiveness was questionable. Loading Hughes's wrapped remains required 4 people and took nearly 10 minutes due to the difficulty of maneuvering the awkward bundle in extreme wind conditions. As the first helicopter lifted off at 2:52 p.m., its departure created a moment of profound isolation for the 23 survivors remaining on the ice. The sound of the rotors faded quickly in the howling wind, leaving only the eternal soundtrack of the Arctic winter, and the knowledge that rescue for the remaining group members would depend on weather conditions that were continuing to deteriorate rapidly. The second helicopter, identical to the first, arrived 18 minutes later, but was forced to abort its initial landing attempt when a sudden gust of wind caught the aircraft and nearly caused it to impact a pressure ridge that had been invisible in the blowing snow. Captain James Nakayama, the pilot, circled twice before finding a suitable landing zone further from the survivors, but on more stable ice. This evacuation proved even more challenging than the first, as several of the remaining survivors were showing signs of advanced hypothermia and required assistance to walk the additional distance to the helicopter. The wind had increased to the point where people had to link arms to avoid being separated in the whiteout conditions created by blowing snow, and the temperature had dropped another 3 degrees. 6 more survivors were evacuated on the second flight, leaving 17 people still on the ice as weather conditions approached the absolute limits for helicopter operations. Radio communication with rescue coordinators indicated that the approaching storm system was intensifying more rapidly than predicted, with sustained winds expected to exceed 70 miles per hour within the next 2 hours. The third helicopter evacuation attempt, scheduled for 3:45 p.m., had to be delayed and then cancelled when wind conditions exceeded safe operating limits for the aircraft. Captain Santos attempted one approach but was forced to abort when severe turbulence made aircraft control impossible, and the decision was made to suspend air rescue operations until weather conditions improved. This left 17 survivors stranded on the ice, with night falling, temperatures continuing to drop, and a major Arctic storm system bearing down on their location. Tukumik immediately began implementing emergency survival protocols, using their remaining shelter materials and supplies to create the best possible protection against conditions that threatened to become genuinely lethal before rescue could resume. The night of January 19th became a brutal test of human endurance and survival skills as the storm system reached full intensity. Wind speeds peaked at 78 miles per hour, creating a ground blizzard that reduced visibility to 0 and made any movement outside their shelter impossible. The temperature dropped to negative 48 degrees Fahrenheit, with wind chills reaching negative 85, cold enough to freeze exposed flesh in less than 60 seconds. The survivors huddled together in their inadequate emergency shelters, sharing body heat and trying to maintain morale as the storm raged around them with a fury that seemed almost supernatural. The sound was unlike anything most of them had experienced, a constant howling and shrieking that penetrated their shelters and made conversation impossible except by shouting directly into someone's ear. Several people showed signs of advancing hypothermia despite their best efforts to stay warm, including 2 elderly congregation members who began exhibiting confusion and disorientation that indicated their core body temperature was dropping to dangerous levels. Tukumik rotated people through the center positions in their shelters, where shared body heat was most effective, while monitoring everyone for signs of frostbite or more severe cold injuries. The psychological stress of spending the night on the ice where their pastor had been killed and partially consumed, combined with the physical stress of surviving in extreme conditions, pushed several survivors to the edge of mental breakdown. 3 people experienced what appeared to be panic attacks, hyperventilating and expressing fears that the polar bear would return during the night to attack them in their vulnerable state. Sarah Atkinson later described that night as the longest 12 hours of her life, marked by periods where she genuinely believed she might not survive until morning. The constant noise of the wind, combined with the claustrophobic conditions in the shelter, and the knowledge that Hughes's blood was still visible on the ice just yards from their location, created a surreal nightmare that challenged her sanity as much as her physical endurance. Dawn on January 20th brought slightly improved weather conditions, with wind speeds dropping to 45 miles per hour and visibility improving enough to see approximately 100 yards in any direction. The temperature had risen to negative 35 degrees, still dangerous but within the range where helicopter operations might be possible if conditions continued to improve. Tukumik re-established radio contact with rescue coordinators at 7:23 a.m., reporting that all 17 remaining survivors were alive, but several were showing signs of moderate hypothermia and required immediate medical attention. Two people had developed frostbite on their extremities despite precautions, and the general psychological state of the group was deteriorating rapidly. The fourth helicopter evacuation began at 8:45 a.m. under marginal weather conditions that represented the absolute limits of safe operations. Captain Santos and her crew managed to extract 8 more survivors, including the 2 most seriously affected by hypothermia and frostbite. The helicopter operations were complicated by the need to navigate around areas where Hughes's blood was still visible on the ice, as several survivors became hysterical when forced to approach the attack site. The final helicopter evacuation was completed at 10:17 a.m. on January 20th, removing the last 9 survivors from the ice after they had spent nearly 24 hours stranded in some of the most extreme weather conditions on Earth. Tukumik was among the final group to be evacuated, having remained on the ice until all other survivors were safe, despite suffering mild frostbite on his face and hands. The evacuation of Hughes's remains required a separate operation using a larger helicopter with specialized equipment for handling bodies in extreme conditions. The Alaska State Troopers and Fish and Wildlife Service investigators were present during this final recovery operation, documenting the scene and collecting evidence related to the bear attack. When investigators examined the attack site, they found evidence of a prolonged stalking behavior that indicated the polar bear had been following the group for at least several hours before the attack occurred. Bear tracks were discovered at multiple locations along their route, suggesting that the animal had paralleled their movement while staying out of sight behind pressure ridges and other ice formations. The bear tracks at the attack site told a clear story of predatory behavior that contradicted Hughes' interpretation of the encounter as a spiritual test. The animal had approached from downwind to avoid detection, used available cover to get within striking distance, and selected Hughes as a target, not for any theological reason, but because the pastor had separated himself from the group and presented the most vulnerable target. Analysis of Sarah Atkinson's photographs provided unprecedented documentation of a polar bear attack on humans, including several frames that clearly showed the bear's approach and the initial moments of the attack. These images would later become crucial evidence in wildlife management decisions, and would be used to educate other Arctic travelers about polar bear behavior and safety protocols. The autopsy performed on Hughes' remains revealed that death had occurred almost immediately after the bear's initial attack, as the animal's teeth had penetrated his skull and caused massive trauma to his brain and cervical spine. This finding provided some comfort to survivors who had worried that their pastor had suffered prolonged agony during the attack, though it did little to diminish their psychological trauma from witnessing the event. All 29 survivors were transported to the Samuel Simmons Memorial Hospital in Utqiagvik for medical evaluation and treatment. Physical injuries were relatively minor, considering the extreme conditions they had endured, with most people suffering from mild to moderate hypothermia, various degrees of frostbite, and dehydration. However, the psychological trauma was severe and would require extensive counseling and support for all survivors. Martha Kowalski's hypothermia was the most serious medical issue among the survivors, requiring intensive care and gradual rewarming over a period of several days. Her advanced age and the extended exposure to extreme cold had brought her dangerously close to fatal hypothermia, and her survival was largely attributed to the rapid response of rescue personnel and the medical care provided by Janet Morrison during the evacuation. Dr. Davidson suffered a severe psychological reaction to witnessing the bear attack, experiencing symptoms consistent with acute stress disorder that would eventually develop into post-traumatic stress disorder requiring extensive therapy. His divorce proceedings, which had been temporarily suspended due to the emergency, resumed with his wife, citing the Arctic expedition as evidence of his deteriorating mental state and poor judgment regarding their children's welfare. Sarah Atkinson's role as the primary photographer of the attack created unique psychological challenges, as she struggled with guilt about documenting Hughes's death rather than attempting to help him, even though any assistance would have been impossible given the circumstances. Her photographs became the subject of intense media interest, creating additional stress as she tried to balance scientific objectivity with respect for her pastor's memory and her own grief. The investigation into the circumstances surrounding Hughes' death was conducted jointly by the Alaska State Troopers, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and the North Slope Borough Wildlife Department. The investigation focused on whether proper safety protocols had been followed and whether the bear attack could have been prevented through different decisions or actions by the group leaders. Tukumik's role as guide came under particular scrutiny, as investigators examined whether he had provided adequate warnings about polar bear dangers and whether his decision to fire warning shots had contributed to the bear's aggressive behavior. However, the investigation ultimately concluded that Tukumik had acted appropriately given the circumstances and that his actions had likely prevented additional casualties. Hughes's decision to continue the pilgrimage despite bear tracks and deteriorating weather conditions became a central focus of the investigation. Survivor testimonies revealed that Tukumik had repeatedly advised turning back due to safety concerns, but that Hughes had overruled these recommendations based on his religious convictions about divine protection. The investigation report, released 6 weeks after the attack, concluded that Hughes's death was the result of an unprovoked polar bear attack that occurred despite appropriate safety precautions being in place. The report noted that polar bear attacks on humans are extremely rare, but emphasized that Arctic travelers must understand they are entering the habitat of one of the world's most dangerous predators. Media coverage of the attack was extensive and often sensationalized, with news outlets focusing on the dramatic circumstances of a pastor being killed during a religious pilgrimage. The story received national attention and sparked debates about the wisdom of religious leaders taking their congregations into dangerous wilderness areas for spiritual purposes. Several news organizations attempted to purchase Sarah Atkinson's photographs of the attack, offering substantial sums for exclusive rights to images that clearly showed the bear killing Hughes. Atkinson ultimately decided to provide the photographs to wildlife authorities for educational and research purposes, but refused to allow their commercial use. Stating that profiting from her pastor's death would be morally wrong. The bear responsible for Hughes's death was never located and killed, despite extensive searches by wildlife authorities. Polar bear management protocols generally call for the destruction of bears that have attacked humans, but the vast Arctic landscape and the animal's natural camouflage made tracking it impossible. The bear's behavior suggested it was a healthy adult male operating within normal predatory patterns rather than a diseased or abnormally aggressive animal. Wildlife biologists who analyzed the attack noted that it represented classic polar bear predatory behavior, with the animal demonstrating sophisticated hunting skills, including stalking, target selection, and efficient feeding patterns. The attack provided valuable scientific data about polar bear behavior around humans, contributing to improved safety protocols for Arctic travelers. The financial impact of the rescue operation was substantial, with helicopter operations alone costing more than $180,000 due to the extreme weather conditions and multiple evacuation flights required. The North Slope Borough absorbed most of these costs as part of their public safety responsibilities, though questions were raised about whether groups undertaking high-risk wilderness activities should be required to carry insurance to cover potential rescue expenses. Hughes' death had profound implications for First Light Evangelical Church, which struggled to maintain cohesion in the aftermath of losing their charismatic leader under such traumatic circumstances. Several families left the congregation, citing concerns about the church's direction and leadership decisions that had led to the tragedy. Others remained, but insisted on new leadership that would take a more cautious approach to wilderness activities. The church's insurance company initially refused to provide death benefits for Hughes, arguing that his death occurred during an activity that violated policy provisions about engaging in unnecessarily dangerous activities. This decision was eventually reversed after legal pressure and media attention, but the dispute created additional stress for Hughes's widow Margaret during an already difficult period. Margaret Hughes faced intense scrutiny from both media and legal authorities regarding her knowledge of her husband's plans and whether she had any responsibility for preventing the dangerous expedition. She maintained that she had trusted her husband's judgment and his faith that God would protect the group, though she privately expressed regret about not insisting that he cancel the pilgrimage when weather forecasts showed deteriorating conditions. The psychological impact on survivors extended far beyond the immediate aftermath of the attack. Several people required extensive therapy to deal with post-traumatic stress disorder, while others experienced ongoing anxiety about wildlife and outdoor activities that significantly affected their quality of life. Support groups were established to help survivors process their experiences and cope with the long-term effects of witnessing such a traumatic event. Thomas Carlyle's pre-existing mobility issues were complicated by psychological trauma that made him reluctant to leave his home or engage in any activities that involved potential physical risk. His prosthetic leg, which had malfunctioned during the expedition, became a source of particular anxiety as he associated the mechanical failure with his vulnerability during the bear attack. Dorothy Carlyle struggled with guilt about their decision to participate in the pilgrimage, feeling that they should have recognized the dangers and stayed home given Thomas's physical limitations. Her relationship with her husband became strained as both of them processed the trauma differently, with Thomas becoming increasingly reclusive while Dorothy sought social support through counseling and survivor support groups. Janet Morrison's medical training had helped her remain functional during the crisis, but she later experienced delayed psychological reactions that affected her ability to work in emergency medical situations. She took extended leave from her position at the Utqiagvik Health Clinic and eventually transferred to a less stressful administrative role within the healthcare system. The broader community of Utqiagvik was also affected by the incident, as it highlighted the ongoing challenges of balancing economic opportunities from tourism and religious activities with public safety responsibilities. Local government officials implemented new regulations requiring wilderness guide certifications and mandatory safety briefings for any group activities in polar bear habitat. Tupcomyq's reputation as a guide was ultimately enhanced by his professional handling of the crisis and his role in preventing additional casualties. However, he struggled with personal guilt about being unable to prevent Hughes's death and questioned whether he should have refused to guide the expedition despite the financial pressures facing his family. He eventually continued working as a guide, but implemented much stricter safety protocols and became more selective about clients he was willing to serve. The incident prompted changes in polar bear management policies throughout Alaska and northern Canada, with wildlife authorities developing new protocols for responding to bear attacks and providing better education about polar bear behavior to Arctic travelers. The attack became a case study used in wilderness safety training programs and wildlife management courses throughout North America. Research based on the attack contributed to improved understanding of polar bear predatory behavior and the factors that increase risk of human-bear encounters. Scientists noted that climate change was forcing polar bears to spend more time on land and bringing them into contact with humans more frequently, making education about bear safety increasingly important for Arctic communities and visitors. The attack also sparked discussions within evangelical Christian communities about the appropriate balance between faith and prudence when undertaking potentially dangerous activities for religious purposes. Some religious leaders argued that Hughes' death demonstrated the dangers of presuming upon divine protection, while others maintained that his willingness to risk death for spiritual purposes represented the highest form of Christian devotion. Sarah Atkinson eventually changed her major from wildlife biology to psychology, citing her experience with the bear attack as motivation to help others deal with trauma and crisis situations. Her photographs of the attack remained sealed in evidence files, though she occasionally provided consultation to researchers studying human-wildlife conflicts and the psychological impact of witnessing violent animal behavior. Dr. Davidson's career in the oil industry ended after his psychological trauma from the bear attack made it impossible for him to work in remote locations or high-stress situations. He eventually found work in an office-based position with an environmental consulting firm, though his divorce proceedings continued for another 2 years, and resulted in very limited custody arrangements with his children due to concerns about his mental stability. The location where Hughes was killed became something of a pilgrimage site for some members of his former congregation, who believed his death represented a form of martyrdom that demonstrated his absolute faith in God. However, these visits were strongly discouraged by local authorities due to ongoing polar bear activity in the area and the practical dangers of reaching the remote location. Wildlife tracking data collected in the months following the attack suggested that polar bear activity in the region had actually increased, possibly due to changes in ice conditions that affected the animal's traditional hunting patterns. This data supported arguments that climate change was making human-bear encounters more likely and emphasized the need for greater caution when traveling in Arctic regions. The bear that killed Hughes was never definitively identified or tracked, though several large male polar bears were observed in the general area during the following months. Wildlife authorities maintained protocols for destroying any bear that could be proven to have attacked humans. But the vast Arctic landscape and the animal's natural behavior patterns made such identification extremely difficult. Long-term follow-up studies of the survivors revealed that most people eventually recovered from their immediate psychological trauma, though many reported lasting changes in their relationship with nature and wildlife. Several survivors became advocates for wildlife safety education, using their experience to help others understand the realities of living and traveling in predator habitat. The incident became one of the most thoroughly documented polar bear attacks on record, providing valuable data for wildlife managers, emergency responders, and researchers studying human-wildlife conflicts. The combination of eyewitness testimony, photographic evidence, and detailed investigation reports created an unprecedented record of polar bear predatory behavior and its impact on human victims and witnesses. Hughes' death ultimately served as a catalyst for improved safety protocols and better education about Arctic wildlife dangers, potentially preventing similar tragedies in the future. However, for the 29 people who survived the attack, the memory of watching their pastor being killed and partially consumed by a polar bear remained a defining trauma that would influence their lives and perspectives forever. The legal implications of the incident continued for years, with various lawsuits filed by survivors and Hughes' family against different parties, including the church, the guide service, and equipment manufacturers. Most of these cases were eventually settled out of court, though the litigation process created additional stress for people who were already struggling with psychological trauma from the attack. Insurance companies throughout the industry began reassessing their policies regarding wilderness activities and religious expeditions, with many adding specific exclusions for activities in polar bear habitat, or requiring additional safety measures and guide certifications for coverage to apply. These changes made such expeditions more expensive and logistically complicated, potentially reducing the frequency of similar incidents. The story of Hughes's death became part of the oral history of Utqiagvik and the broader Inupiaq community, serving as a modern example of the ancient truth that the Arctic demands respect and humility from all who enter its domain. Local elders incorporated the incident into their teachings about traditional knowledge and the importance of understanding animal behavior and weather patterns for survival in polar regions. Years later, survivors would still gather occasionally to commemorate Hughes's death and support each other through ongoing psychological challenges related to their shared trauma. These gatherings typically included prayers, sharing of memories about their pastor, and discussions about how the experience had changed their understanding of faith, nature, and human vulnerability in the face of forces beyond their control. The incident served as a stark reminder that despite modern technology, communication systems, and rescue capabilities, humans remain vulnerable to natural forces and wild animals when they venture into remote wilderness areas. Hughes's death demonstrated that no amount of faith, preparation, or good intentions can completely eliminate the risks inherent in traveling through habitat occupied by apex predators adapted by millions of years of evolution for efficient killing. The polar bear that killed Pastor Richard Hughes on January 19, 2024, represented something far more complex than simple predatory behavior. It embodied the intersection of climate change, human encroachment into wild spaces, religious conviction, and the eternal struggle between civilization and the natural world that continues to define life in Earth's most extreme environments. The attack lasted less than 30 seconds, but its impacts would ripple through the lives of survivors, their families, and their communities for decades to come, serving as a permanent reminder that in the Arctic, the difference between spiritual transcendence and tragic death can be measured in the time it takes a polar bear to cover 30 yards of sea ice.